time for us to begin our conference. You will have translation of the conference in 3 languages: English, French, and German. You have also your translation devices. Madam Speaker, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome all of you to the conference War and Peace. In the name of European People's Party Group, I would like to thank Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Wilfried Martens Center for excellent teamwork what we had in organizing this conference. I also would like to thank all speakers who accepted the invitation to participate in the conference and share with us their considerable experience and reflections on 70 years of war and peace in Europe. And I will dare also to give some introductory remarks on our deliberations. This May we celebrate 17th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. For European, it is a day of remembrance and commemoration of those who gave their lives to defeat Nazi tyranny. To remember means also to recognize the difficult moral lessons of the conflict. The Second World War was not the simple tale of the good defeating the evil. It brought a lasting peace to one part of Europe and enslavement by totalitarian communism to another. The victory over Nazis became a turning point in the relations among the West European countries. The balance of the first half of 20th century was horrifying. 2 world wars, bloodbath for a decade, and more than 60 million dead. Therefore, after the war, the West European leaders undertook a commitment to exclude war as a form of dealing with disagreements among European nations. One of the keys to Europe's success story was denazification, legal, political, and moral purification from a totalitarian regime. The European peace order emerged on the basis of historical reconciliation and cooperation among countries, and above all, the respect of international law and agreements. Dear colleagues, however, the victory had a dark side. In Yalta, the Western allies yielded before the military weight of the Soviet Union and left Eastern Europe in the clutches of Stalin. This led to the Iron Curtain that was splitting Europe for 45 years. Stalin and his henchmen in Eastern Europe, meanwhile, implemented massive repressions in the name of communism. The Gulag expanded and the number of deportees increased, specifically during the post-war era, culminating around 1950. But out of the ashes of the World War, a new European peace order emerged. It was formally enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and reaffirmed by peaceful reunification of Germany and the democratic changes in Central and Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain that separated Europe was finally gone, and Europe could once again had a chance to become united, whole, and free. Former captive nations quickly and ambitiously implemented far-reaching reforms, and just in 14 years joined the European Union. Political and economic transformations in Central and Eastern Europe went hand in hand with an evaluation of the totalitarian past. To one extent or another, all of these countries have undergone a process of coming to terms with their past. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that lack of such honest dealing with the past is one of the key factors why today we see the foundations of European peace order under attack. Putin's Russia is redrawing European borders by armed force, and to justify the aggression, it uses the myth of the Great Patriotic War to mobilize and consolidate the Russian nation for a struggle against external enemies, the liberal democratic Europe. Under the slogan of the fight against the rebirth of fascism in Europe, A truly dictatorship has openly taken the path to confrontation against the EU and NATO, even threatening us with the use of nuclear weapons to preserve its sphere of influence. Putin may wish to use Victory Day to bolster his regime, but the tens of millions of Russians who fought to rid the world of Nazism deserve better. In Russia and beyond, they should be honored for extraordinary sacrifices they made, and for no other purpose. Dear friends, the lesson I draw from the recent dramatic changes in European peace order is a very simple one. If we want to preserve peace for another 70 years, we have to be prepared to defend it. That means rapid increase of smart investment in our defense. That means learning to protect our societies from sophisticated non-military tools of hostile regimes. That means finding the strength to face the truth, no matter how unpleasant and frightening it might be. I thank you for your attention. And now I have the honor to introduce the next speaker, the director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the former president of European Parliament, Hans-Gert Pottering. Hans-Gert, the floor is yours.
Dear Sandra Kalniete, Madam Speaker of the Latvian Parliament, now I must say, and I regret to say it, dear former colleagues of the European Parliament, but sometimes I think I'm an honorary member of the European Parliament, whether I still have the right to say dear colleagues, so this question should be legally experienced so that I have the right pronunciation for my colleagues, and I will not mention one. I look into your faces. If I mention one, then I would forget others. And it's really great to be back. And I had the honor to serve here in the European Parliament for 35 years. And I said to Professor Snyder, when I spoke to our Hungarian friend, when I came to the European Parliament in 1979, it would have been a vision to think of the idea to have colleagues from Hungary or Estonia, Latvia, from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all the other countries, Poland, and so on. And this miracle has realized. So, dear Tomi Hutanen and dear Professor Timothy Snyder as our main speaker, dear panelists, I want to bring to all of you the best greetings of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which I have the honor to share and to be here with you today in this beautiful Espace Yehudi Menuhin. I was told one can speak in his or her native language, and so allow me to speak in the language of Schiller and Goethe, although my German is not so good as it was from Goethe and Schiller. But I will now continue in my German language, and I think you have translation if you don't understand German. Am 8. Mai 1945 kapituliert die deutsche Wehrmacht bedingungslos und der Zweite Weltkrieg endet. Unser Kontinent liegt in Trümmern. Zahllose Städte sind zerstört, die Wirtschaft liegt am Boden. Europa ist ein anderes Wort für Krieg und Zerstörung. Und mein eigenes Land, Deutschland, war an seinem moralischen Tiefpunkt. Der Krieg hat unvorstellbare 55 Millionen Menschenleben gefordert. Millionen sind auf der Flucht, Eltern ohne Söhne, Frauen ohne Männer, Kinder ohne Väter. Und erlauben Sie mir persönlich zu sagen, als ich am 15. September 1945 geboren werde, gilt mein Vater als vermisst. Er wird später für tot erklärt. Ich habe ihn nie kennengelernt und habe vor einigen Jahren in der Nähe von Stettin einen Soldatenfriedhof besucht im heutigen Polen, was damals Deutschland war. Und möglicherweise 2/3 der dort Beerdigten sind nicht identifiziert, hat mein Vater seine möglicherweise letzte Ruhestätte gefunden. Und ich darf hier in diesem Kreis sagen, dass diese persönliche Erfahrung für mich auch der Grund ist für mein Leben, das ich der Einigung Europas im Wesentlichen gewidmet habe durch 35 Jahre Abgeordneter im Europäischen Parlament. Meine Damen und Herren, über die Verantwortlichkeit für den Ausbruch des Zweiten Weltkrieges gibt es keinen Zweifel. Das nationalsozialistische Regime hatte seinen Rassenwahn und Machtanspruch zu einer unvorstellbaren Aggression gegen alle anderen Völker Europas gesteigert. Der Holocaust wurde sein schlimmstes Verbrechen. Der NS-Totalitarismus führte unseren Kontinent ins Verderben. Sieger im eigentlichen Sinne gab es 1945 keine. Allenfalls gab es glückliche und unglückliche Überlebende, die einen im Westen, die anderen in der Mitte und im Osten Europas. Im Westen entstand mit amerikanischer und britischer Unterstützung geleitet neues Leben in Freiheit, in Respekt vor der Menschenwürde, mit Demokratie und rechtlich gesicherter Marktwirtschaft. Nach 1945 entstand Europa von seinem atlantischen Westrand her neu. Erschöpft, aber im Glück des freien Neubeginns rückten die Völker des europäischen Westens zusammen. Der Schuman-Plan, die Europäische Gemeinschaft für Kohle und Stahl, wurde zur Grundlage für eine neue Ordnung der Beziehungen zwischen den Staaten und den Völkern Europas, zum Fundament des Friedenswerkes, das für uns heute längst eine Selbstverständlichkeit ist. Und meine Damen und Herren, überlegen wir einmal, was es bedeutet, 5 Jahre nach Ende dieses schlimmsten aller Kriege, dass das Versöhnungszeichen aus Frankreich kam von Robert Schuman, einem engen Weggefährten Konrad Adenauers. Und das war nicht selbstverständlich, denn die Logik war bisher in der europäischen Geschichte, dass Frankreich und Deutschland nach einem Krieg sich wieder hochrüsteten, um den nächsten Krieg vorzubereiten. Und da kam ein Mann wie Robert Schuman und hat diese Logik, diese Spirale durchbrochen und ein Zeichen der Versöhnung gesetzt. Von der Hoffnung auf einen neuen Neubeginn waren 1945 auch die Völker der Mitte, des Ostens und Südosten Europas erfüllt. Als Menschen desgleichen, des uns allen gemeinsamen europäischen Kulturraumes, hofften sie auf eine neue Lebenschance in Freiheit und Frieden. Sie mussten jedoch die bittere Erfahrung machen, dass Frieden ohne Freiheit nur eine halbe Befreiung vom Joch des totalitären Unrechts war. Der sowjetische Machtanspruch zerstörte ihre Hoffnung. Und ich will hier aber ausdrücklich sagen, dass wir schätzen müssen, dass auch sowjetische Soldaten den Nationalsozialismus bekämpft haben und auch zur Befreiung Deutschlands führte. Aber das totalitäre Regime der Sowjetunion hat eben den Menschen in der Mitte und im Osten Europas die Freiheit genommen. Zwar war der NS-Totalitarismus besiegt, aber der stalinistische Totalitarismus führte Europa in die Spaltung hinein. Er überzog die Völker Mittel-, Ost- und Südosteuropas mit seinen Unrechtsregimen. Die Hoffnung aber blieb auch unter den unglücklichen Überlebenden des Zweiten Weltkriegs lebendig. Die Hoffnung auf ein gemeinsames, geistlich, moralisch und politisch erneuertes Europa mit der Perspektive des Wohlstands für alle seine Bürgerinnen und Bürger. Bis zur Erfüllung dieser Hoffnung sollte es jedoch lange dauern und Sandra Kalniete hat darauf hingewiesen. Erst vor einem Vierteljahrhundert erfüllte sie sich. Berliner Mauer und Eiserner Vorhang fielen. Europas Spaltung war zu Ende. Allerdings endete sie nur teilweise. Das Vorgehen Russlands auf der Krim hat belegt, dass sie noch nicht vollständig überwunden ist. Und gestatten Sie mir zu sagen als einem Deutschen, wir sind uns bewusst, die Einheit Deutschlands in Freiheit hätte es nicht gegeben, ohne Solidarność in Polen, ohne Johannes Paul II., ohne den Freiheitswillen der Völker in Estland, Lettland, Litauen, in Ungarn und in all den Völkern in der Mitte Europas. Und dieses verpflichtet uns, die Deutschen, die damit natürlich auch die Bürgerinnen und Bürger der früheren DDR haben für die Freiheit gekämpft. Sie wurden Unterstützung von den Menschen in Westdeutschland. Aber ohne den Freiheitswillen der Europäer in der Mitte und im Osten Europas hätte Deutschland seine Einheit nicht wiederbekommen. Und das verpflichtet uns für alle Zukunft, das ist meine sehr entschiedene Meinung als Deutsche, zur Einigung und zum Frieden und zur Freiheit unseres Kontinents. Ja, wenn Sie mögen, ist eine Ermutigung für diese Position. Eine Lehre, die wir nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg gezogen haben, lautet: Frieden ist mehr als die Abwesenheit von Krieg. Die nach dem Krieg geschaffene Friedensordnung in Europa gründete sich nicht mehr auf die Abgrenzung von Interessensphären einzelner Großmächte, sondern auf Freiheit, Demokratie und Rechtsstaatlichkeit. Es war die Sehnsucht nach diesen Werten, die Solidarność in Polen, die Freiheitsbewegung im Baltikum, die Montagsdemonstranten in Leipzig, Dresden, Berlin und vielen anderen Städten der damaligen DDR 1989 auf die Straßen drängten. Unsere Werte sind unser moralisches Fundament. Dank ihnen hat sich Europas Anziehungskraft in den vergangenen Jahrzehnten als stark erwiesen, als stärker als die leeren Versprechen der menschenverachtenden Ideologien des Sozialismus und des Kommunismus. Die sowjetische Diktatur erwies sich spätestens 1989/90 als wirtschaftlich pleite und war bereits längst politisch und ideell bankrott. Dagegen belegen viele Ereignisse in den letzten 25 Jahren die bleibende Attraktivität der europäischen Idee. Aber gleichwohl empfehle ich uns, bescheiden zu bleiben. Auch wir sind nicht das Paradies auf Erden, auch wenn wir, wie wir glauben, der bessere Teil der Welt sind. Ich nenne die Osterweiterung der NATO und der Europäischen Union. Die Beitritte der neuen Mitgliedstaaten erfolgten freiwillig und nicht auf Druck der NATO und der Europäischen Union. Russlands Vorwurf, NATO und EU hätten sich auf ehemals sowjetisches Territorium ausgedehnt, ist falsch. Die neuen Mitgliedstaaten haben schlicht ihre 1989/90 getroffenen politischen Entscheidungen institutionell vollzogen. Sie haben von ihrem Recht auf freie Selbstbestimmung Gebrauch gemacht. Gleiches gilt für das Angebot der östlichen Partnerschaft an unsere Nachbarländer, an die Ukraine und Weißrussland, an Georgien und die Moldau, an Armenien und Aserbaidschan. Es ist ein Angebot der Europäischen Union, kein Diktat. Georgien, die Moldau und die Ukraine haben in freier Selbstbestimmung von diesem Angebot Gebrauch gemacht. Umgekehrt akzeptieren wir die Entscheidung all jener Staaten, die dieses nicht tun. Zuletzt haben uns auf dramatische Weise die Ereignisse auf dem Maidan in Kiew, die Revolution der Würde und die nachfolgenden Entwicklungen gezeigt, wie stark der Wille vieler Ukrainer ist, die natürlich auch nicht alles richtig gemacht hat. Wer kann schon alles richtig machen auf dieser Erde? Niemand. Den Wille der Ukrainer, den Weg nach Europa zu gehen, denn sie sind Europa. Wie stark die Anziehungskraft der europäischen Idee ist, wie sehr das europäische Land Ukraine zu Europa gehören will. Das russische Vorgehen zeigt dagegen, die Idee der europäischen Friedensordnung wird nicht allgemein akzeptiert oder gar respektiert. Wir müssen sie auch heute, 70 Jahre nach dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkrieges, nach wie vor entschlossen und engagiert verteidigen. Aber ich sage ebenso entschlossen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wir dürfen Russland gedanklich nicht aus Europa ausschließen. Der westliche Teil Russlands gehört zu Europa, und würden wir Russland gedanklich ausschließen, wir würden in eine fortwährende Konfrontation hineingehen. Was wir brauchen, ist gegenüber Russland, auch wegen der Aggression gegenüber der Ukraine, wegen der Annexion der Krim, eine klare Sprache auf der Grundlage der Wahrheit und gleichzeitig die Fortsetzung des Dialogs. Meine Damen und Herren, diese Konferenz verbindet den Blick zurück mit dem Blick nach vorn. Wir wollen an den Krieg erinnern und die Entscheidungen betrachten, die als Antwort darauf getroffen wurden. Daraus folgt die Frage, wie wir heute auf Grundlage dieser nach wie vor gültigen Werteentscheidung Herausforderungen angehen können. Ich freue mich sehr, dass es gelungen ist, für die Keynote-Speech einen ausgewiesenen Experten für ost- und mitteleuropäische Geschichte gewonnen zu haben. Ich begrüße herzlich von der Yale University Professor Timothy Snyder. Herzlich willkommen. Sie, verehrter Professor Timothy Snyder, werden gleich unser Wissen über den Zweiten Weltkrieg und dessen Folgen und Konsequenzen für Mittel- und Osteuropa erweitern. Wir sind gespannt auf Ihre Rede. Ihr Werk Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, zeigt eindrucksvoll, wie stark die Mitte und der Osten Europas unter dem Terror des nationalsozialistischen und des sowjetisch-kommunistischen Regimes jahrzehntelang zu leiden hatten. Und ich möchte an eine Persönlichkeit erinnern, die dieses mit dem Schicksal des eigenen Lebens symbolisiert, nämlich der vor 10 Tagen etwa verstorbene Wladislaw Bartoszewski, der in den Lagern Hitlers ebenso gelitten hat wie in den Lagern Stalins. Und sein Freiheitswille und seine Festigkeit, sich gegen jede Form des Totalitarismus, der Diktatur zu wenden, kann gerade jungen Menschen heute ein Beispiel sein, wie wir in die Zukunft gehen können. Und deswegen finde ich, es ist ein guter Anlass, heute auch an Wladislaw Bartoszewski zu erinnern. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, es ist für uns wichtig, dass wir die Erinnerung wachhalten, nicht um in welcher Weise auch nostalgisch zurückzuschauen, sondern um die Lehre daraus zu ziehen für die Gegenwart und die Zukunft. Und so wie der Mensch als Mensch angelegt ist mit seinen Fähigkeiten und mit seinen Fähigkeiten zum Guten wie zum Bösen, kann alles wiederkommen in anderer Form, wenn wir heute und jeden Tag nicht unsere Pflicht tun für Freiheit, Frieden und Rechtsstaatlichkeit. Und es entsteht hier in Brüssel ein Haus der europäischen Geschichte. Die Umbauten sollen im Juli fertig sein und ich hoffe, dass dann vor der Sommerpause des Jahres 2016 wir das Haus der europäischen Geschichte hier im Park hinter dem Parlament dann einweihen können, um die Geschichte in unserer Erinnerung zu halten, aber nicht nur als Rückblick, sondern als Mahnung für die Gegenwart und die Zukunft und dass wir Europäer den Weg gemeinsam in die Zukunft gehen, auf der Grundlage der Freiheit, der Demokratie, des Rechtes und der Menschenwürde. Ich bitte um Nachsicht, wenn ich vielleicht etwas länger geredet habe. Sie sind immer hier in Brüssel, nicht alle, aber Professor Snyder nicht, aber die meisten, die hier im Raum sind. Ich bin gestern Abend von Berlin gekommen, reise gleich wieder, allerdings mit dem Auto, weil in Deutschland dummerweise die Bahn bestreikt wird. Ein ziemlich törichter Streik, wie ich finde. Aber lassen Sie uns diese Belanglosigkeiten nicht zum Gegenstand dieser wichtigen Konferenz machen. Ich bin sehr dankbar dafür, dass ich hier sein darf, dass ich Ihnen einige meiner Überlegungen vortragen durfte. Und ich wünsche dem Europäischen Parlament, ich wünsche Ihnen allen, dass es uns vergönnt ist, durch das 21. Jahrhundert zu gehen. Und ich schaue in viele junge Gesichter, es ist Ihr 21. Jahrhundert. Mein Weg, naja, er liegt hoffentlich noch einige Zeit auch vor uns. Ich wünsche jedenfalls unserem Kontinent, der Europäischen Union, dass wir nicht nur das Symbol der Freiheit und der Demokratie bleiben, sondern es auch vorleben. Und wir haben gewaltige Herausforderungen, wenn Sie nur an das Mittelmeer und an die Tragödien denken, die dort passieren. Wenn wir das nicht bewältigen, stellt es auch die Legitimität der Europäischen Union in Frage. Die Würde des Menschen ist der Kern. Sie gilt für jeden Menschen auf dieser Erde, in Europa und darüber hinaus. Und in diesem Sinne wünsche ich unserer Konferenz gute Erkenntnisse und Ihnen alles Gute für das, was Sie tun, auch für Sie persönlich. Und ich darf nun Herrn Professor Timothy Snyder bitten, zu uns zu sprechen, der den langen Weg aus den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika zu uns genommen hat. Herzlichen Dank. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, especially for the mention of Władysław Bartoszewski. The name is probably a good place to start because Bartoszewski reminds us of the inherent plurality of European history, reminds us that even the strongest parts of European history are accompanied by other strong parts. So a man who was in Auschwitz could also be a rescuer of Jews. A man who was in a German concentration camp could also be held in Stalinist prison. And a man whose life was shaped by the Second World War could live long enough to shape not only communist Poland, but also the free Poland since 1989. European history is rich, and that richness will be my theme today. Now, of course, every good lecture begins with a problem and tries to solve that problem, or at least sketch out what that problem is. The problem with which I would like to begin today is the problem which confronts all of you, this problem of commemoration. In its weak form, one could state this problem in this way. The end of the Second World War will be commemorated in 3 days in Moscow, and most of Europe will not be present. That's the weak way of forming the problem. The strong way is to ask the following question. 10 years from now, when we reach the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, will there be a European Union? Will this problem even arise? Will there be a Europe, right? And will there be soldiers marching on Red Square? What will the regime be in Russia? I think these are open questions, and I think their answer depends partly upon how well we can think through European history today. So if I take that as my justification, I hope you won't mind if we spend the next 45 or 50 minutes together trying to think this through. So let me begin with the problem. It is obviously the case that the contribution of Russia and of Russians 70 years ago to ending the Second World War was decisive, or at least extremely important. 80% of the German casualties were on the Eastern Front. For all the significance of the British and the French and the Americans, 4/5 of the German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The huge majority of fatalities and wounded on the Allied side were in the Red Army. 3 million Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner and were effectively killed by deliberate starvation in German camps, in the second largest German war crime after the Holocaust, one which is largely forgotten. 1 million Soviet citizens, most of them Russians, starved or died of disease in the siege of Leningrad. These are crimes which alone exceed the entirety of the suffering in the Second World War in most Western countries, including my own, and these, of course, must be recalled. So the question then arises, given the obvious significance of all of this, given the undeniable need to commemorate the Second World War in Russia, why is this not happening together, or why is this commemoration not a European one? Now, when you invite a historian to give a lecture, there is always the danger that he or she will talk about history, and I'm afraid that I'm about to do that. What I would like to claim is that what we have here is a moment to reflect upon the ways in which Europe has come to think about its own history, good and bad, and to contrast those with the ways that the current Russian government is considering its own history. So I'd like to begin by asking, not literally asking because then you would answer, but I'm going to begin by asking, what is it about the parade in Red Square which is so uncomfortable, right? There are some obvious answers. One is that the myth, that the simple myth of the monopoly of virtue of the Red Army is difficult for East Europeans to accept. Everyone knows this. I'm not going to dwell on it. The very simple point that the Red Army, while liberating from German rule, also brought Soviet rule. Every East European knows that. Many Europeans, I think, are also made uncomfortable by the idea that national history is the same thing as European history, by the attempt to impose a Russian view, no matter how understandable, on the entirety of Europe, and to condemn other views as being somehow necessarily wrong. I want to push beyond this a little bit, though, and suggest that there are a few more reasons why I think Europeans are uncomfortable. I think one of them is the military parade as such, as a cultural form. More militaristic societies like military parades, less militaristic societies don't like them. It's interesting that both Russia and China this year will be celebrating, commemorating the end of the war with a military parade. I think another more specific reason is that this military parade, as I'm sure many of you will know, is also meant to demonstrate the fighting force of the Russian army. So a number of new weapons will be pulled out across Red Square. The Russian press has drawn quite a lot of attention to this, and of course, Some of these new weapons will be weapons, or some of these weapons are weapons which are familiar, right? So for example, the Buk anti-aircraft system, which shot down MH17 over Ukraine, will now be pulled across Red Square. So anyone who is watching the parade will be watching the weapon system which shot down a civilian airliner. Going a bit deeper, or continuing on this point, it's uncomfortable, of course, that this military parade takes place during a Russian war against Ukraine. It's uncomfortable that some of the soldiers who will be taking part will be soldiers who have been decorated for their participation in the war in Ukraine. President Putin has decorated 3 units of the Russian army for combat in Ukraine. It's uncomfortable that some of the Russian journalists who will be covering the parade have been decorated for their coverage of the invasion of Crimea. These are all things which I think are uncomfortable. But I want to suggest that we can go a bit deeper and consider the thing which I think is truly most uncomfortable for Europeans, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and that is using the War of 1945 as a justification for the war of 2015. The claim which is made in various ways that the invasion of Ukraine is justified by the Russian or the Soviet victory in the Second World War. Now, or to put it a different way, the confusion of a war of defense with a war of aggression, right? The idea that because the Soviet Union defended itself against Nazi Germany and Romania and Hungary and Italy and Slovakia and a coruscant from Spain, let's not forget that. But because the Red Army defended itself, therefore Russia has the right to invade Ukraine. That's a very confusing idea, and what I want to try to do is to bring to bear some thoughts from history about what this actually means. So how could history be useful in considering this problem? The first point that I would want to make, the first thing that every historian would say about all this, is that Russia faces a kind of normal problem, a post-imperial problem. How do you separate national history from imperial history? How do you separate Russian history from Soviet history? Where exactly do you draw the line? What exactly do you do? Because to make the obvious point, as I'm sure all of you know, the Red Army was not a Russian army. The Red Army was the army of the Soviet Union. The only army which called itself Russian during the Second World War was actually fighting on the German side. The Red Army was a Soviet army. Roughly half of its soldiers were Russian, roughly half of its soldiers were not Russian. And so this raises the question of how you treat this mixed inheritance. A second point that all historians would make about this situation is that there's a difference between commemoration and history. That's probably the first point I should have made. There's a difference that commemoration itself has a history. So you might think that the Soviet Union has always commemorated the 9th of May as Victory Day, but that would be a mistake. They've commemorated it since 1965. It was part of the Brezhnevite mythologization of the Second World War. It was something which was very popular among the generation of the 1970s, which is now in power in Russia and in Belarus. Commemoration itself has a history. And it's worth pointing out that in general, the commemoration of the Second World War coincided with periods of greater oppression in the Soviet Union and in Russia. So Brezhnev commemorated more than Khrushchev. Putin commemorates more than Gorbachev. So the act of commemoration has its own political history. The third thing, and maybe the most important thing that any historian would point out about this problem, is that the Soviet Union was on both sides of the war. This is the basic problem with commemorating the end of the war, that the Soviet Union was on both sides of it. That the Soviet Union was on the German side when the war began in 1939, and then it was on the Allied side when the war ended in 1945. Now, it doesn't take a very smart historian to point this out, and I would like to emphasize that this is not a problem which I'm introducing from outside the Russian discussion. On the contrary, this is a question which arises from Russian commemoration itself. Last year, which was the 75th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that is, the 75th anniversary of the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which began the Second World War. Last year, President Putin rehabilitated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That is, last year, President Putin, in a speech before Russian history teachers, said that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was probably a good idea. So this question of how you commemorate defeating Nazi Germany while at the same time endorsing being an ally of Nazi Germany is an internal Russian question. And it's the significance of this question, which I'd like to spend a little bit time now explaining. Could someone get me a glass of water? Because it's always awkward if I go back and get it myself. Oh, could someone who's a member of the European Parliament get me a glass of water? So the way I'd like to proceed is to consider some of the issues that arise from trying to combine the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the commemoration of the end of the war. So it'll be obvious to everyone who's here from the Baltic states or from Poland what it means to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? To rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is to rehabilitate the beginning of the Second World War. It's to rehabilitate the invasion of Eastern Poland. It's to rehabilitate the annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's to rehabilitate the deportation of about 500,000 citizens of these countries to the Gulag. It's to rehabilitate the Katyn massacre, that is the murder of about 22,000 Polish citizens. It's to do an extraordinary thing to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And what I want to spend most of my talk doing is to try to explain what the relationship is between rehabilitating the beginning of the war and rehabilitating the end of the war. Now, let me start with the way the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has been discussed historically in the Soviet Union and now in Russia. There's a crucial period, a very important period, and I warned you, a historian will sometimes talk about history, and that period is when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was actually enforced. Between 1939 and 1941, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was, of course, public knowledge in the Soviet Union. It was presented as a very good thing. Soviet propaganda was turned against Britain and France and no longer against Nazi Germany. So there was a very odd period in which the Soviet Union was still anti-fascist, but Nazi Germany was not treated as the main fascist state. Now, this is worth remembering because it tells us how the fascism, the term fascism, need not actually be directed at fascists. It's directed against whoever is the target of Soviet foreign policy. So while the Soviets were allies of Nazi Germany, the Nazis themselves were not fascists. Other people were fascists. So this is crucial because it teaches us about the flexibility of this term. Between 1945 and 1990, the Soviet position was that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had never happened. It was not only a taboo, its existence was entirely denied. The documentation of it was revealed around 1990, and since then, of course, everyone knows that it took place. The period that interests us, the most recent period, is the period since last year when President Putin rehabilitated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And it's the juxtaposition of rehabilitating an alliance with Germany with glorifying the defeat of Nazi Germany, which concerns us. And what I want to ask is, what is actually going on here? What does this mean for Russian commemoration and for European commemoration? Now, before I begin this discussion, I want to stress two things. The first is that what I want to do with this is something positive. I don't just want to criticize Russian commemoration, because you can criticize everyone's commemoration. You can certainly criticize American commemoration. What I want to try to do is use this as an opportunity to consider what some of the more successful attempts at contemporary history have looked like. What I want to do is to try to consider what exemplary European commemoration looks like, or to put it more broadly, in what European institutions or from what European traditions or practices do we actually get good versions of commemoration? Because of course it's easy to criticize, and all nations have moments when you can criticize them. So what I want to try to do is consider what I think are four sources or four dimensions of laudable, of successful European commemoration or historical practices. What I want to try to claim is that in the last 25 years or so, we see that pragmatic, useful, exemplary commemoration or historical discussions come from four sources. They tend to be social, that is arising from civil society. They tend to be international, that is involving more than one European nation. They tend to be critical, that is reflective upon oneself in a critical fashion, and they tend to be responsible, that is they tend to involve taking responsibility for events in the past. So what do I mean by this? And if you accept, just for the time being, that these are good criteria for what a responsible historical discussion looks like, how does the Russian treatment of the Second World War actually correspond to these things? Well, let's begin with civil society. Many of the important European discussions about the Second World War have to do with civil society, whether it's the Historische Streit in Germany, which begins from one philosopher, whether it's the discussion of the Holocaust in Poland, which begins with a book which was published for free by one small non-governmental organization, whether it's the discussion of totalitarianism in Russia, which has a great deal to do with a few non-governmental organizations, such as Memorial. Non-governmental organizations, journalists, and historians acting at their own initiative and unpredictably, and unpredictability is crucial, are part of reconsidering the past. The Second World War, I think we've learned, is not something which can be, the reconsideration of it cannot be planned. It tends to come from below. And here I think we see some of the problems with the contemporary Russian discussion. In Russia today, rather than non-governmental organizations, although they of course exist and are very important, and I'm going to use many of their arguments in what follows, the government overwhelms them with government-organized non-governmental organizations. Particular non-governmental organizations such as Memorial, which I've already mentioned, are subject to harassment and repression. The government uses the idea of the falsification of history to suppress discussions which are contrary to the current line. And the foreign minister and the president take it upon themselves to say what's historically true and what's historically not true. So what I'm trying to claim is that part of the problem, or one of the sources of the problem, is that the discussion has not been sufficiently social, or it hasn't arisen from civil society. A second criterion, I think, of a useful European discussion is that it's been international. Not because someone else's history is correct, right? It's not that French history is right and German history is wrong, or German history is right and French history is wrong, or that Polish history is right and German history is wrong. It's that the confrontation with other perspectives can often generate something new, right? It's very hard to generate something new just inside the confines of one national discussion. So European discussions which have worked have tended to be international. They tend to have involved multiple historians from multiple countries. And so here we have an opportunity, I think, to ask how one would discuss the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? Or how one would discuss the Second World War in Russia. If you're going to discuss the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, if you're going to rehabilitate it, for example, it would make sense to have a discussion among Jews, because Jews were very much concerned by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact when it was announced during the World Zionist Congress. The president of the World Zionist Congress, when it was announced, said, "My only prayer is to meet you again alive," which was perfectly justified, since most of the Jews in Europe lived on the territories affected by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and most of them would be murdered within 3 years after its signing. So a discussion about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact might involve Jews. It would certainly involve Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, not because everything they have to say about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is right or reasonable, but because it affected them. Likewise, a discussion of the Second World War from 1941 to 1945 has to involve, I think from a Russian point of view, right, for it to be useful and interesting, it should involve the Poles, who suffered on a scale which is comparable to the Russians. It has to involve the Belarusians, who suffered more as a territorial group, who suffered more than anyone else. That is, more people on the territory of Belarus were killed or deported than people on the territory of any other European country. It has to involve Ukraine, which was the main German war goal and which was occupied by Germany for a great part of the war, and which proportionately suffered more than Russia did. So a discussion of what 1941 to 1945 means and what victory means has to involve, at a minimum, those kinds of groups. Likewise, it goes without saying that if one is going to discuss victory, then the audience has to be broader. It has to include Hungarians and Czechs and Slovaks and Yugoslavs and all East Europeans who then experienced communism, because the question of what victory means hangs a lot on what comes after it. But let me make a further point, and I promise this will be the one truly American thing that I'm going to say. If the question of victory in 1945 is also a question of international history in the broadest sense. Part of the limitation of the idea of the Great Fatherland War is that it limits the war to Europe itself, right? And when you limit the war to Europe itself and you imagine the war as the Red Army liberating Eastern and Central Europe, you can overlook a couple of important things. One is that there was another war going on in the Pacific, which the Americans essentially won by themselves. And from the point of view of contemporary Russian thinking about geopolitics, I think this is an important thing not to forget. If you're going to model your international relations on the Second World War, it's probably worthwhile to remember that you, during the war, had an American ally in Asia. The second thing, which is interesting and maybe worth remembering, is that when the Red Army started beating the Wehrmacht, or when the Red Army returned to Eastern Europe, it was driving American jeeps and automobiles, which is just a simple and obvious example of the way that American technology helped the Soviet Union to win the Second World War. I cannot be 100% sure, but I have a feeling that on the 9th of May, American technology is not going to be commemorated. But if one is going to treat the Second World War as a model for contemporary international behavior, American technology is something that's worth remembering, right? Cutting yourself off from American technology is not in the tradition of the Second World War in the Soviet Union. The tradition of the Second World War in the Soviet Union was to exploit American technology. Okay, but that's just the kind of very simple thing you can say when you internationalize the discussion. The next thing I'd like to claim is that a good European discussion of contemporary history is critical. That is to say, the point is not, and of course the Germans have been exemplary in this, the point is not to say defensively how what happened during the war was right. The point is to ask difficult questions about one's own history. And here, I mean, the opportunities in Russian history for critical discussions are considerable. And when I say this, I'm not saying that it's only true of the Russians, right? It was correct for America to have a discussion about putting its Japanese Americans in internment camps. It was correct for the United States to have a discussion about the correctness of dropping atomic bombs on Japan, a discussion which is ongoing. It's correct for everyone to have a critical attitude about their own history. But in the case of Russia, I think we have some particular opportunities, especially with the current president who's in power. So for example, the question of whether it made sense to murder half of the higher officers in a Great Terror in 1937 before a war. The question as to whether in general the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, which killed something like 700,000 Russian citizens, roughly half of them on what was going to be the front of the war, whether this was actually preparation for war, as Molotov and Kaganovich insisted, as Stalin himself said, or whether perhaps it was not preparation for war, or if it was preparation for war, maybe it wasn't the best possible preparation for war. These are discussions which a president who himself was a KGB officer, I would think would have a particular facility in beginning if he so desired, because these are questions of intelligence. Likewise, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact itself, which Stalin defended as the best way to hold off Nazi Germany, was that in fact the case? Did it make sense to invite the Wehrmacht closer to Moscow, which is what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact entailed? Even strategically, was it a good idea, leaving the morality and the politics aside? Strategically, did it make sense to bring the Wehrmacht all the way to eastern Poland? One could argue that perhaps it was not such a good idea. One could also ask why it was that Stalin ignored more than 100 intelligence warnings to the effect that the Wehrmacht was massing for an attack on the Soviet Union. If the claim is going to be that Stalin was a good manager, right, one then has to ask, if he was such a good manager, why didn't he pay attention to the intelligence information which was arriving to him, which is related to the question of Soviet losses, which of course were enormous. And one of the reasons Soviet losses were so enormous was that they were confronting the Wehrmacht, which was probably the best army in history, carrying out its major operations. But there are perhaps other reasons why Soviet losses were so great, which had to do with the management of the war itself. And then, of course, a last question which one would want to ask, I think from a Russian point of view, is why was there resistance to Soviet rule when it returned? So these are just questions that one would ask critically. The final criterion for, I think, for useful, for a pragmatic, for a fruitful European discussion is the criterion of responsibility. And by responsibility here, I mean, in particular, responsibility for the Holocaust, which I agree with my late friend Tony Jutt is a kind of marker of European commemorative discussions. Now, what do I mean by responsibility? I mean that the moment you treat history as national, you have to begin from a sense of responsibility. As a professional historian, I have to say history is not, in fact, national, that the national framework doesn't work. But the moment you commemorate nationally, the first step has to be to take responsibility for the nation. If you're going to claim that the nation exists and has a history, then the first step has to be to take responsibility for what the nation has done. And this is, with respect to the Holocaust, this has been a kind of useful check. It's led to important discussions about national innocence and guilt in France and in Poland. There are important discussions yet to come in other places like the Baltic states and Romania. I have no doubt those discussions should and will take place. It's also a discussion which has to take place inside Russia with connection to the Soviet Union and to Russia itself. Because, of course, Soviet citizens took part in the Holocaust massively. The first half of the Holocaust, the murder of 2.5 million people by bullets, took place with collaboration of Soviet citizens. One can ethnicize those people. One can say that they were Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians and ethnic Germans and Tatars and Estonians and so on. One can say that, and that would be true. But the one thing they all had in common was that they were Soviet citizens. It was only in the Soviet Union that the Holocaust took place by bullets. And so if one is going to consider the history of the Soviet Union during the Second World War, this is something which has to be brought into the picture. Likewise, Russians in general do not behave any differently than anyone else. So there are Russian guards at Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec. There are Russian policemen carrying out the Holocaust, not only in Russia, but also in Belarus and in Latvia. There are Russian neighbors denouncing other Russian neighbors. There are Russians moving into Jewish houses. Not that they were worse than any other Soviet citizens. They behaved exactly like other Soviet citizens, and in fact, they behaved in general the way that all Europeans behaved, which means that the discussion in Russia perhaps should follow normal European lines. The point I'm trying to make, to emphasize, is not that Russia is different than anyone else. It is that the moment that you decide that your history is Russian history, it has to begin from Russian responsibility, and that one of the normal European topics would be responsibility for the Holocaust. That is all normal. I mean, that the discussion hasn't taken place in Russia, that's not so surprising. It generally takes European countries a long time. If you consider France, which had much better conditions for this kind of discussion, it still took more than 40 years for the discussion truly to take place. Even in Germany, where the conditions were much better, a serious discussion of the Holocaust waits, in my view, until the 1980s. So it's not surprising that it's taken so long. What is unusual in the Russian case, or in the case of contemporary Russia, and what I think is what bears a certain amount of attention, is that responsibility, rather than being taken, responsibility has been exported. And this is new. This is something which in general European countries have not done. The Holocaust has been ignored, or it's been blamed on Germany, but what European countries have generally not done is blame other European countries for it. And the particular move which has been made in Russian propaganda, which is particularly, I think, of concern, is to take all of the responsibility for the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, that is, for those 2.5 million or so Jews in the Soviet Union who were killed, and place it on specific ethnic groups who used to be part of the Soviet Union. So the idea that the Holocaust in the Soviet Union is the fault of the Estonians or the Latvians or the Lithuanians, or today the Ukrainians. Now, there's a reason why you can make this claim, because plenty of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, or Ukrainians were involved in the Holocaust. But the idea that it was an ethnic crime, or that Russians have the right to say that it was the Ukrainians, that is something that is new. Rather than taking responsibility, exporting responsibility to your neighbors is something entirely new, I think, in European commemorative practices. And it's something which is worth paying attention to because of its consequences. the relationship between that kind of behavior and war is, I think, very, very close. I think it's the moment when you export responsibility that you are creating the justification for aggression against your neighbor. Because if it's your neighbor who bears the blame for everything bad which happened in the Second World War, then naturally it would make sense to attack that neighbor. And it's in this way that we approach the Russian rationale for the war in Ukraine. The Russian rationale for the war in Ukraine has to do with the idea that the Ukrainians are somehow to blame for the bad aspects of the Second World War, and that Russians naturally bring the good aspects of the Second World War. There is simply no reason to think this. Russians and Ukrainians both had played very mixed roles in the Second World War, as any serious Russian or any serious European Ukrainian history would have to acknowledge. So if that's all true, I mean, if it's fair to say that getting commemoration wrong in the specific sense of exporting responsibility to your neighbor tends to lead to war, what would this mean specifically for Ukraine, for Russia, and finally for Europe? So it gives us a way of looking at the specific course of events in Ukraine, which we might not have otherwise. If we think of the Russian rationale for the intervention in Ukraine, the Russian rationale was that the Ukrainian state, in the normal sense, has ceased to exist. So, for example, when the Americans and the British brought up the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, the response of the Russian Federation was that Ukraine no longer exists, therefore our signature on the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, by which, of course, Russia promised not only not to interfere in Ukraine, but to protect Ukraine. Ukraine no longer exists, therefore that doesn't hold. That is the same rationale that was used in 1939 when the Soviet Union invaded Poland, almost word for word. The idea was that the Polish state no longer exists in a normal sense, therefore we're not invading a state because there's no longer a state there. Likewise, the ethnic and the linguistic justifications of the Russian intervention in Ukraine are the same kinds of justifications which were used in 1939. When the Red Army crossed the Polish border in 1939, the claim was, we are protecting ethnic brethren, we are protecting Russian speakers, we are protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians who have to be protected. So the arguments are exactly the same and are actually strikingly similar. Another way all of this immediately becomes relevant for Ukraine is if you consider the instrumentalization of the Holocaust itself. So the odd thing which happened in which, let's not remember it, which occupied the minds of many Europeans and Americans for that matter for much of 2014 was the question of, as someone put it to me after the last lecture I gave, are all Ukrainians really fascists, right? Now, that whole way of phrasing the question is an export of responsibility, and that whole way of phrasing the question is a way of uniting the Second World War with the current World War, with the current war in Ukraine. And that whole way of posing the question is a way of interpreting 1941 to 1945, which is highly national, but which is also highly trivializing. Because one aspect of that claim was the idea that the Ukrainians were Nazis. And that was used in particular to arouse Jewish public opinion against Ukraine. The consequence of that kind of discussion of the Holocaust, in which you simply say, it was my neighbor and not me, it was my neighbor and not me, is to trivialize the Holocaust as such. Using it as a weapon in this kind of way has the consequence, and perhaps the intended consequence, of making the Holocaust less significant than it really should be. For Russia itself, this move of exporting responsibility, I think, may have the greatest consequences because it calls into question some of the basic terms of political discourse. If you're going to define yourself, for example, as working against fascism, right, which many Russian institutions do, and if you're going to use fascist as a term of opprobrium, if that's going to become your political vocabulary, what does it mean to simultaneously rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? That is the greatest alliance with the greatest fascist power, in the most significant alliance with the greatest fascist power that ever took place. What does it mean to simultaneously do that? The concern, of course, is that when you do that, you're taking the meaning out of your own term, right? That even from the point of view of Russia, the word fascist ceases to mean anything. And then you expose yourself to a couple of dangers. I mean, the first is that no one takes you seriously when you talk about fascism, which of course is a problem because the rise of the far right is a big problem in Europe. But the second is that if fascism loses all of its content in the Russian language, it then becomes difficult for Russians to recognize certain things in Russia itself, right? Now, I'm not claiming that Russia is a fascist country, which it's not. What I am claiming is that there are certain aspects of fascist tradition which are slightly more visible in Russia than they are in other places, let's put it like that. So, for example, military parades themselves are something which fascists generally liked quite a lot. The cult of a particular leader, right? A particular personal leader, a bit of a fascist thing. The obsession with homosexuality also kind of tends in that direction. The ethnic logic of foreign policy, claiming that you defend ethnic brethren. The associated the denial of the significance of international law and state borders. All of those things push in the direction of the far right. And of course, you need, in Russian and in other languages, you need a language to criticize that, right? But if the word fascism loses all of its significance, or if it's a word which only applies to other people, then it's hard to know what the language would be they would use to criticize that. But there's a sharper version of all this, of course. So what I just put before you is the innocent version, right? That Russians would like to be critical, but they're losing their language for doing so. There's a sharper version of this, which is that the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and combined with the glorification of the victory over Nazi Germany, is intended as a contradiction. That it's meant to be a contradiction. That it's not, or to put it a different way, by certain people who advocate something called a conservative revolution in Russia, it's not seen as a contradiction at all. Because the enemy are the liberals in the middle. The enemies are the Democrats in the middle. Therefore, an alliance between far right and far left makes perfect sense, right? That is one rationale which one sees for simultaneously rehabilitating the beginning of the war and glorifying the end of it. And it has a policy realization, right? It has a policy realization. The policy realization is inside the European Union, where the Russian Federation now supports, as you all know, because this has finally made it into the press, the Russian Federation supports the extreme right by, for example, inviting them to observe the electoral farce in Crimea. It supports separatism. It supports the populist far right. It supports all of the far right forces in Europe which are against European integration. This is the contemporary realization of the politics of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The idea of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the first time around, it didn't work, but the idea was you take the European far right, Nazi Germany, and you turn it against Britain and France. You turn it against the European order. That was the idea. The idea this time around is that you take the European far right, that is the extreme right and the populists, and you turn them against the European order to bring down European integration. This is the contemporary politics of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And when I predicted a year ago that Russia would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this is what I had in mind, that Russian foreign policy is using the same idea of reaching out to the far right to undermine the European Union. Which brings me to the very last point that I want to make, which is what this all might mean for Europe itself. So for Europe itself, I think what we see is that Europe is facing this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in practice, and thus far is only beginning to realize what this might mean. That if Europe is a project of integration, it's logically possible that someone could have a policy of disintegration, which was aimed at the European Union. That's a logical historical possibility, and in fact, that it is what's being realized. What concerns me a bit, though, is that, or more than a bit, in fact, what concerns me quite a lot is that Europe may not have the historical resources to defend itself against this kind of thing. And what do I mean by this kind of thing? What I mean by this kind of thing is history which is not only not the good things. It's not social, it's not international, it's not critical, it's not responsible, but it's history which is deliberately chaotic. It's history which is meant to sow discord and confusion. The contradiction between supporting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and celebrating the end of the war is not a contradiction which Russia is going to solve. It's a contradiction which is going to be pushed out to you. If you criticize them for rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they will condemn you for that. If you criticize them for celebrating the end of the war, they will also condemn you for that. They're not going to resolve the contradiction. They're going to leave that contradiction with you. They're going to put it into European discourse, and they're going to let you deal with it. And the question for me is how well European resources, historical, intellectual, moral, can respond to this. What we have is a kind of contest, I think, between the good European model, and when I say that, I don't mean it's always followed by all Europeans. I mean it's occasionally followed by some Europeans. The good European model of history as lessons, right? History from which you draw lessons, as Sandra Cagnetta was discussing, and history as license. History is a kind of resource with which you can do anything you want. And it's just not clear to me where that contest is actually going to end. One of the reasons why I'm not sure how it's going to end is that, of course, the Russian approach plays on, exploits, draws from weaknesses in Europe and, of course, in North America itself. Our history, too, is very often narcissistic. Our history, too, is very often national. The way that European history is taught is shockingly national, given the extent to which European integration has proceeded in other forms. And it's precisely this which allows Russian policy to make the inroads that it does to Germany or to Hungary or to France. If there were more European history, that kind of engagement, I think, would be harder than it actually is. It is also the case that the concept of memory, which we have privileged in the last quarter century over history, is infinitely flexible. It tends to be relativistic. It tends to take the form of, I have a memory and you have a memory. And if your memory turns out to be extraordinarily aggressive towards my memory, I have very little to say about it, right? It's just a memory. It's entirely subjective. If you opt entirely for memory over history, you're depriving yourself of one of the ways to defend yourself against this kind of infinite flexibility. This infinite flexibility which ends up aiding this kind of anti-enlightenment. So it seems to me, to bring this to a conclusion, that we are at a kind of breaking point, that what appears to be just the commemoration of the war is actually something much, much greater, that the absence of European leaders from Red Square is not just a momentary reaction to this or that war or this or that Russian behavior. It actually signals a crisis within the European order itself. Because it's not, of course, the case that Europeans, when they don't go to Red Square, know where to go. This is one of the striking things. If you don't go to Red Square, you immediately have to improvise and decide where you're going to go. Am I going to stay at home with my family? Am I going to lay some flowers at the unknown soldier? Am I going to go to Gdańsk? There is no European place to go. And that's because there isn't a European history of the Second World War. Now, there are good tendencies. And these are the tendencies I've identified as social, as critical, as responsible, as international. And those tendencies, I think, are there and worth developing. And I think in this moment of crisis, it's worth considering precisely what the European model of coming to terms with the past is. Because to end where I've begun, it's not enough to criticize Russia at this particular point. We all have our moments in commemoration which are less than ideal. That includes all European countries, it includes the United States. It's not enough to say that this is inadequate. It's more important to notice how this particular inadequacy involves exporting Russian problems into a European discourse, and then asking yourself, what are the European frameworks which might actually allow us not only to respond, but to treat this moment as a challenge and therefore as an opportunity to decide what European history is all about and how Europeans ought to be pursuing their own history. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Am I taking questions? Am I?
This one working? Oh, yes, it is. Let me start with a technical announcement. Unlike what is noted in the paper you got, we skip the Q&A for now. So we'll start with panel discussion because we're already running a little bit behind schedule. But then at the general Q&A, we'll invite Tim Snyder back to the stage so you'll all have the opportunity to ask him questions, which of course is very good for me because that forces everybody to stay for the panel discussion if he only wants to ask a question to him. So now I'd like to start with panel discussion, inviting our speakers. First of all, I want to invite the unfortunately only lady we have on our panel, Françoise Thome from Paris University. As you you'll find bios of all of the speakers in the handout, so I won't introduce them in length, just name them. Our second guest comes from Poland. Jacek Dubinik, please. Of course, we have a Russian guest as well, because we understood that it's very important to have a discussion, and we also understand that Russia is not only Putin, there are other voices, and I'm very happy that we have one of these voices, Andrei Zubov. And then we have one of the best German experts on Russia today, Boris Reitschuster, who used to be a journalist in Russia for, I don't know, 15 years or so, 16 years. So that's... And last but not least, I'd like to invite Roland Freudenstein to the stage. Probably don't need to introduce him. And as you can see already, looking at the poster we put up here, we are covering both history and current politics, so our questions and discussion will go a little bit back and forth, but we have experts on both Russia today, Europe today, and Russian and European history. And we'll start with a discussion which will later then open up to the audience, where you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Let me start with a really important plea to everybody, both on the panel and in the audience. As soon as we start taking questions, please be very brief, so we have more opportunity to a lively discussion. Thank you. Mrs. Thome, we already heard a little bit by Timothy Snyder about the difference between the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War, and why the Great Patriotic War, the term Great Patriotic War, is more ubiquitously used in Russia than the Second World War is. Do you see any other aspects than the ones Timothy mentioned, why this is the case, and what role does it mean for Russia today?
Yes, there are internal reasons and external foreign policy reasons for this special emphasis on patriotic war. The concept of patriotic war has crystallized, it's very interesting to observe it, it has crystallized in 1863 at the time of the Polish insurrection. It was then the Patriotic War was the first Polish-Russian war in 1612, and the second Patriotic War was the Napoleonic War in 1812. Why did this theme appear then during the Polish insurrection? The Polish insurrection was perceived as an attack of Europe and attack of Catholicism against Russia, and it has led to an enormous patriotic wave which led to this concept of patriotic war. The crushing of the Polish repression was shown in the Russian media by Katkov, Aksakov, as a new patriotic war. The internal reason I was alluding to is that the Patriotic War is a bridge, builds a bridge between the two Russias, between the Russia of the ruled and between the elites of Russia. You see these themes in the Slavophile writings of this time. So Patriotic War is a way to bring back the westernized elites of Russia to a contact, a healthy contact with the people, with the Russian people who are not westernized. And that's an important point which is present now in Putin's Russia, when there is a war, a kind of propaganda war against the elite, which use the theme of popular support for Putin and for the war in Ukraine from below. That's the first point. Second point is that the Patriotic War, the victory in the Great Patriotic War, has proved that the Soviet system is superior to the other systems, to the other existing systems, including the democratic systems. It has shown the superiority of a despotic system against all others. And in the eyes of Russian establishment, victory over Hitler's Germany has laundered the Stalinist regime of its crimes. It's a way to erase the crimes of the Stalinist regime. This is very important too. The celebration of the Great Patriotic War has begun in 1965, and I think it's interesting because it's a time when the utopian elements of Soviet ideology are abandoned after the fall of Khrushchev, and the regime seeks to find a legitimacy in the past. There is another aspect, and now I am alluding to the foreign policy aspect. Brezhnev launched this cult of the Great Patriotic War when he was thinking of launching the détente policy with Europe. And the celebration of the war was a way to reassert the legitimacy of Moscow's control on Eastern Europe. It's not, of course, a coincidence. It's very significant. Under Putin, other aspects of the Great Patriotic War are emphasized. The main aspect is the aspect of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the beginning of the carving up of the European continent. And in the mind of Russia's rulers today, Yalta is a continuation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It is, in their view, the Western powers were forced to accept Moscow's hegemony on Central and Eastern Europe because Stalin was in a position of force. He could impose it. And this is, by the way, completely historically incorrect because during Yalta, Stalin had the hope of controlling all of Europe. He didn't think of dividing Europe. He was waiting for the departure of the American soldiers from Europe, and he had the hope of controlling all the European continent. And from Churchill's and Roosevelt's part, there was no idea of dividing Europe because Stalin had signed the Declaration of Liberated Europe, which promised the organization of free elections in the liberated countries. So it was all on the contrary, Roosevelt and Churchill believed that the Soviet Union had renounced this policy of sphere of influence. Of course, they did not, Churchill did not believe it very long, but at the time of Yalta, it was their belief. So I wanted to stress this misunderstanding on Yalta and this false interpretation that the Russians have imposed on the Yalta conference as a sharing of Europe. And to conclude this point, I think Putin's policy now is in quest of second Yalta. And Putin, maybe from the very beginning of his mandate, has sought this new carving of sphere of influence. In 1999, Putin said to Clinton, to Bill Clinton, he was not yet president, Putin, he said, you the Americans, you have South America, you have Africa, at least you could leave us Europe, which is very revealing in 1999. The crisis we are now experiencing with Ukraine has to be understood in a much broader context. In this context of seeking a new carving up of sphere of influence with America, with the United States.
Thank you very much. And now let's get straight to Russia and the question which meaning the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War actually has in Russia today. And I mean not only in a propagandistic way as it is used by or exploited by the government, but how it is really commemorated. Does it really play a role for the broader public? Mr. Suboff, if you can say anything about that.
You see, it's necessary to understand that in today's Russia, all pre-communist history of Russia is the history of some other country. It's not more close to Russian mind than, for example, the history of ancient Rome to today's Italians. That's why when in 2012 government tried to organize celebration of 2-century victory in the Patriotic War against Napoleon, nobody among simple people supported this idea. They were absolutely out of this problem. It was only official celebration. But the Great Patriotic War, the war of 1941-1945, is absolutely different thing. This is the only positive, collective identification for majority of former Soviet people, since all other events are almost negative. I mean, these repressions, these totalitarian regime camps, and all other, and nationalization of property, of land, etc. The war against peasantry. The only positive thing is, and of course, such elements as, for example, Sputnik, Gagarin, it is the achievement of scientists. It's not the achievement of all the people. But the war is the war of all the people. Since in each Russian family today, you can find somebody who rather took part in this war, or his parents took part in this war, or grandparents. You can see on many cars in Moscow this small slogan, thanks to grandfather for the victory. In Russian, спасибо деду за победу. So it's a really common thing, this victory. But the celebration of victory has different understanding in different periods of post-war Russia, post-war Soviet Union. You know very well that in 2 years after the end of the Second World War, the celebration of victory was prohibited by Stalin in 1948. Why? Because this victory, in the sense of the majority of Russian people, was the victory not only over the totalitarian Hitler regime, but it was also the hope for better life in post-war Soviet Union. Life without collective farms, life without repressions against religion, life without repressions at all. But nothing like this occurred. And besides this, during the war, many Russian people felt themselves real destiny. They felt destiny. They felt themselves as real soldiers with weapon, and not only some objects of totalitarian regime. And Stalin wanted that this memory ought to be disappear in Russia. Only really in 1965, when the 20th anniversary of the victory was celebrated, Brezhnev, who came to power just half a year before, he declared this victory in war as all the nation celebration day. And after this moment, it turned to be like this. But during the communist regime, this celebration, the main idea of this celebration was the triumph. Triumph over Germany, triumph over capitalism, and only during this period of perestroika, during Gorbachev period, another content came to this celebration. This holiday with the tears on eyes. Праздник со слезами на глазах in Russian. So people began to reflect not only the triumph of victory, but also the price of victory. And the price was very high. 27, 28 millions of people were killed in the Soviet Union. A large part of our country was destroyed. So, and people began to understand that these terrible losses and this destruction and the whole war is not only because of aggression of Hitler, but because of aventuristic politics of Stalin and communists before the war in 30s, and the Pact of Molotov-Ribbentrop as a crucial point of this aventuristic policy. And in 90s, this celebration was the reflection of our tragedy of war. Not the triumph of victory, but reflection of tragedy. And now Putin changed the idea again. He changed it towards Brezhnev's ear propaganda of triumph all over the world, since now the main idea of propaganda is that Russia now is surrounded by enemies, and just as it was in 1941. And so we won in 1945, we will win again. So this is the main idea of today's triumphalistic celebration of victory. But many people in Russia understand victory now in absolutely different manner. They continue to understand this victory as a terrible tragedy, as the end of terrible tragedy of Russian people. Because in Russian language, the name victory has a different connotation. Russian word "победа" means after the tragedy, победа, after the tragedy. So the main idea is that we finished in 1945 terrible tragedy of all Russian people. And up till now, from this time, from the 1945, up till now, when something terrible or difficult occurred in our country, people say, let it be, not only war, be again. Только бы не было войны. Let it be war, not be again. So war understood by the majority of people as a tragedy. And I think this triumphalistic attitude, rather very pleasant to nationalistic consciousness, is in conflict with the real, not only scholar memory, not only historian memory, but also with family memory, with the memory of simple people. Because in each Russian family, you can hear the stories not about triumphs, but about personal tragedies of grandfathers and fathers of today's Russians.
Thank you very much, and I think tragedy is a good buzzword to continue our discussion, because we just learned from Timothy Snyder that probably no other country suffered so much during World War II, apart from the Soviet Union, as Poland. So, Mr. Tybenka, how is World War II commemorated in Poland today? We already heard about the tragic aspects of the Soviet Union, or today's Russia, about the victorious aspect, and of course you know that throughout Western Europe, we would celebrate the 8th of May probably as the day of liberation. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the Polish aspect of commemoration.
Thank you very much for invitation. And I would like to start first with Winston Churchill, because our French colleague mentioned this imperialist and great politician in context of Soviet policy, and also talked about, we heard also about this sphere of interest and division of Europe. Well, Churchill, as a realistic politician, tried to have an agreement in 1944 in October with Stalin, and to divide Balkans into a sphere of interest, to save as much as he could from communism. But we also have to remember that till May 1945, he was a little bit naive about Stalin policy, particularly towards Poland, because he thought that if Polish government would agree on Curzon line, so present border of Poland, so communists would stop on the Curzon line, and then we will have a free Poland. But at the beginning, well, May 1945, it was the time when he changed his mind, and he asked chiefs of staff to if it would be possible to liberate part of Poland, so literally start a war. But it was one of his ideas, so to build the fury. We have one book on this case, that Winston Churchill tried to start the Third World War against Soviet Union in spring 1945. It would be a mistake. Going back to Poland, we have a lot of commemoration. But I think that the best idea is the idea of building, and it is being done, the museum of Second World War. I'm not a great fan of museums without exhibits, and they will not have many real artifacts in these museums. They would rather prefer on films, people talking about what happened, about experience, and they will be looking from perspective of daily life of people who suffered during the Second World War, not so much from the perspective of national history. And some Poles are not very happy about it, because we prefer, as almost each nation, to be the victim of war. But I think that the idea is quite good, and we will see what will be at the end. Of course, we'll have the right to criticize the effect. So, and one good thing is that we are building this museum. Well, after what Timothy Snyder was talking about, this discussion on Polish-Jewish relation, on Polish-German relations. So we did our homework, I could say, and we are quite critical. Some are saying that even too critical to our past and our wrongdoings. Also, as you correctly, Alexander, said, Poles were and Polish Jews were particularly main victims of Nazi German policy during the Second World War. There will be also a commemoration on Westerplatte in Gdańsk, but I would not treat it as a kind of rivalry with Russia. Of course, there will come politicians from particularly Eastern Central Europe, but it's not the question of attendance, but the question of merit. And I think that this is the problem, which is not very well understood in West, the dilemma. Liberation or new occupation in 1945. We heard about it. I visited yesterday a very interesting museum of Belgian army, which is not far from here, and I was watching at sightseeing in Second World War exhibits. Very nice, interesting exhibition, but it's hardly about Eastern Europe. It is, of course, about Russian and Eastern Front. So no point to complain. But about invasion by Nazi Germany and Soviet Union in September 1939, it's less than on Nazi German invasion on Crete in 1941. It was, of course, very interesting example of strategy and military action, but well, it was a minor event in Second World War compared with the beginning of the Second World War. But it's still better than in Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, which is a splendid museum. I think one of the best museum when we are talking about presenting war, where it's hardly difficult to understand how the Second World War started, because there's Munich, something on Ribbentrop-Molotov, but almost nothing on September 1939. But when we are talking about Gdańsk and this commemoration which will happen in a couple of days, I think that we should ask one question after what we heard from Timothy Snyder and our panel colleagues. Do we really need to go to Moscow to attend these military parades, as our leaders were doing before? Because now we don't go because what Timothy said, because of Ukraine. But is it really worth to be a part of this falsification of history? I am using the word which Stalinist propaganda liked very much in 40s and in early 50s. Can I say more? Because maybe two. This is a very nice picture which we have before us. I'm not a great specialist, but it looks like V-Day in London, looking at British and American soldiers and faces of people and clothes. But this is not a good idea to present this picture in context of our talk, because this is Western perspective. There was nothing like this in Warsaw, not speaking about Baltic countries. In Prague, yes, it was. But, well, Beneš should be warned, president of Czechoslovakia, by a Ruthenian case when Stalin suddenly demanded that eastern part of Czechoslovakia should become a part of Soviet Union, although it never was a part of Russia, that he should be careful with Stalin. Thank you.
Thank you, and we learned once more that it's everything about World War II is so difficult, even choosing a picture. And although you recommended not to go to Moscow, let's virtually go to, back to Moscow. Mr. Reitschuster, we just heard from Mr. Zubov how Putin and the government tries to exploit the commemoration of World War II. To your opinion, is this just another way to showcase Russia's glorious past and thus trying to deflect from all the current problems Russia's facing, or is there anything more behind it?
I think there's more. I think it's nearly something like the lifeblood of Putin's Russia. And if you would describe Putin's Russia or Putin's mind and the mind of Putin's Russia with two words, it's too easy, of course, but I would describe it with a feeling of humiliation and insultation. He feels himself humiliated, he feels himself insulted, and you had these waves in the population also, but with his permanent mention, because he permanently mentions it, these waves became a tsunami, and now you have this feeling of humiliation and of being insulted as a main feeling in Russia. And what would be the best way to fight against humiliation, felt humiliation? It's if you feel yourself as a winner. If you say, I'm part of a winner country. And I think that's why the victory is so important and plays such a very, very important role for himself. There's a very interesting saying in Russia. I think you have it here also, but in Russia it's very common. Победители не судят. The one who wins, he's not brought to court. He has no responsibility. And I think for Putin, it's very, very important because he bases his systems. In many points, he bases them on the same structures we had in the 30s. Not in everything, of course, but many things are quite similar. And so he has to be quite afraid of any critical questions, of any attempts to put it under question. And so it's like, I would even exaggerate. I would say Marx said that religion is opium for the people, and Putin tries to make this victory some kind of opium for his people. So you don't have to think about social problems. You don't have to think why you cannot make nearly any product Russian instead of Kalashnikov and oil, which is appreciated all over the world, yes, so you have not to think to make your own Google or Apple or something, but it's just you are a victory people, victory country, and I think that's a tragedy, yes, that this old tragedy now is used as a legitimization of this new tragedy which we have. And it would be quite interesting, we have to ask maybe Timothy later, when Germany had these feelings of being humiliated, of being insulted in the 30s, whether they remembered the last victory over French in 1870 and something, the same way. So this would be quite interesting.
Thank you. So, Mr. Freudenstein, we learned that basically every country commemorates World War II its own way, so maybe we shouldn't care. I mean, we can't come to terms probably with the British how to remember the bombing war, so why should we care about how Russia commemorates the Second World War? Or would you say we should care, we should be scared, or is there anything Europe should do about this?
Well, thank you, Alexander. I think Tim Snyder already said that there, of course, are threatening overtones in the way Russia celebrates the end of World War II, which concern the whole of Europe. Just by the absence of these social, international, self-critical, and responsible elements that should be part of any commemoration. And I also believe that we should indeed make more of an effort to have a common European narrative overarching the national ones that have their own justification, of course. So, to constantly work, and this is something that's not finished, this is something we have to work on, like European integration itself, in a way. We have to work on a narrative that takes into account the different perspectives, and sometimes opposed to the Russian narrative, that exist in other European countries. I mean, I think this is our task. And we should, with a House of European History that President Pöttering mentioned in the beginning, I think we do have a concrete chance. But I'll just take one more step. I think we should generally answer to the threatening overtones that come from Russia, not only in these victory celebrations, but that generally have come from the Kremlin and its media in the past couple of years, but especially since March 2014. I mean, I will never forget the day, a few days after the occupation of Crimea, when Dmitry Kiselyov, one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful man in the Russian media system, went on primetime television and blandly stated that Russia is the only country that can reduce the United States to radioactive ash. Radioactivny popel, right? And in the background, there was an animation with missiles coming out of silos, and at the very end, there was the nuclear mushroom cloud. I mean, that was primetime news in Germany the next day. And in that sense, I think, much of international communication, just like much of Western humor, is actually based on cognitive dissonance, right? Or, call it talking at cross purposes. So, the famous example from my youth that every West German kid loved in the late 70s was the Fawlty Towers series sequel, The Germans, with this absolutely seminal byline caption, "Don't mention the war," right? Actually, the root of the joke in that sequel, with German tourists coming to a British hotel, is that the hotel manager, played by John Cleese masterfully, tells his own staff, "Don't mention the war, they're Germans." Well, he himself gets in trouble then, because he gets into a situation of cognitive dissonance with his German guests about, on the one hand, who started talking about the topic of the war, and then who started the war itself. So it ends up with these poor Germans you want to feel sorry for, saying, but we didn't start it. And he's saying, yes, you did, you invaded Poland. And, in that sense, in all this debate here, we're talking about war and peace. In the wake of John Cleese, I would say, do mention the war. And we actually have 3 wars to mention in this context. 2 were already dealt with. We have to mention the war that ended in 1945, 70 years ago. We also have to mention the war that is going on as we speak. And it's a war of aggression. It's not some kind of Russian action. It's not some kind of just destabilization. Yes, destabilization is the ultimate purpose for the moment. But it is a war of aggression. So let's call a spade a spade. And we've got to talk about a third one, which is the big one, that we hope will never happen. But in order to prevent it, you have to prepare for it. This is a deep paradox. Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, you have to prepare for war. And this is something that we have forgotten over the last 25 years. And I'm afraid the West, Europe and America, will have to relearn deterrence. And that also means also in the context of the celebrations or the commemorations that we have this week. I think we have to relearn deterrence, which implies communicating to the other side that we have the ability, the willingness to actually defend ourselves by military means.
Thank you. So let's start with the Third War and go, take it back to the Russian perspective. Mr. Reitschuster, do you think that a TV show like the one Roland just mentioned about a possible nuclear war is more than chest beating and more than a reassertion for the Russian public, we are a great nation and we could destroy anybody? Do you think there's really an actual threat for the West behind it? How far would Putin go?
Yes, of course, I see a big threat. For 16 years in Moscow, I've learned never to believe what Putin says, but you always have to to watch and hear what the media says. And to get the truth, to understand what's going on, you have to follow the television very carefully. You have to read between the lines. And if you watch Russian television today, unfortunately, I have to say it, so it's hard for me to say it, they are preparing people for a war. It's really, you cannot say it in other terms, it's frightening, and it's hard to say it, but it's very obvious that it's always, it's incredible when I show it to Westerners. They cannot believe it. They say, oh, it's some kind of humor. Yes, it's a humoristic show. I say, no, that's real television. And they cannot believe it. And yesterday I showed it to a German audience, and it was very funny. They said, you're aggressive. You're showing so aggressive things. It's Western aggressive attitude to show such things. I say, sorry. You're mixing up something. It's Russian television I'm showing you. It's not me being aggressive. It's them to be aggressive. So as you told it, we lost this language. We even cannot understand it if we see it from other sources. That's really, we are absolutely not prepared. We are not speaking in these terms. And I always say, you know, we are trying to play checkmates, chess with Putin. We are trying to understand what will be his next move. But the problem is, Putin is not playing chess. It looks like if he plays chess, but you have a Russian kind of chess. It's called Chapayev. You know it. It's when you use the chess figures for fighting as a weapon. And we are sitting, we're thinking, what does he do with this move? Maybe he's going toward my king, but he's thinking about putting it and beating it over your head. And I think we really have this danger. And of course, if you look at the history, it's never the big war started because someone thought, I will start a world war. It's always if someone thinks, maybe I can go this next step without big consequences. And my main fear is, and I will finish, that Putin can come to the conclusion that he can make the same scenario as he made in Crimea in some little region of the Baltic states, and that he will go through with it. And that's my main fear, that he can come to the conclusion he goes through with it. And then we have the big disaster because neither NATO isn't worth the paper the treaties are written on, neither we have a war. It's an absolutely impossible choice. And so we have to avoid this scenario. And we have to understand that it could become real and how dangerous it is.
Thank you very much.
I just would like to add, Russian propaganda has convinced us that the Cold War was a bad thing. We must remember that the Cold War began when the West started to resist Stalin. If the West had always capitulated to Stalin, there would have been no Cold War. So I think a good thing would be to rehabilitate the Cold War and not to be afraid of the concept, because the Cold War, thanks to the Cold War, Western Europe remained free. And to add to what you say, there is a very preoccupying tendency in Russian propaganda of war, which is different from what we had under Brezhnev. There is an heroic, romantic presentation of war. There are lots of films who are shown to the Russian public And for instance, the film on Crimea, on the annexion of Crimea, which is terrible to look at, which shows this romantic approach to war. And Zhirinovsky said recently on Russian television, nation degenerate without war. So the idea that war is a way of regenerating a nation, we know that very well in Europe. We knew this kind of themes we had at the beginning of the 20th century. We have paid very dearly for this illusion, and now we see cropping in Europe the same kind of discourse we had at the beginning of the 20th century, and those dangerous philosophy of force. That force is the relation of force is the main thing. It is highly preoccupying and dangerous.
Thank you. Mr. Zubov, during Cold War, as we already mentioned in the Cold War, there was a Russian song called "Хотите ли русские войну?" Do the Russians want war? So turning again from Putin and the government's perspective to the Russian public, is there really a readiness in the Russian public to risk all the achievements, things they gained, especially during the last decade, just to go war?
Yes. You see, if we see the last sociological inquiries made by Levada Center, the best and most independent Russian sociological service, we see very unpleasant figures. Among all generation, the majority of maybe 80% don't want war and don't believe in the possibility of new large war with NATO, with the United States. But if we see in the figures among young generation, people younger than 35 years old, we see that 40% are accepted. The 40% accept this idea of possibility of nuclear war with the United States and believe that Russia will win. United States will be victorious in this war over the United States or NATO in this probable war. It's a very bad figures. I think that today's Putin's propaganda changed some deep mentality norms in Russian mind. Because, as I have already told, the majority of Russians hated war after this terrible war of 1941, 1945. Hated war. War was the most terrible thing among all other forms of civil activity. And now among young generations there is some romanticism. Yes, you are absolutely right. Some romanticism of the war. I think that in some way it is, as one of Levada Center sociologists, Alexei Levinson, wrote in his article in Vedomosti, so young people who used to play computer games, they supposed to think that they have 10 lives. And so they want to have an experiment in this war. They only forget that the real life is not a net life, you see. So maybe this propaganda, today's official propaganda, is a very dangerous thing both for Russia and for Europe. So this terrible mistake of Putin, which he made last year when he decided to occupy Crimea and to start a war in Ukraine, start the attempt to disintegrate Ukraine, he lost this war, of course. We see that now Ukraine is a rather stable regime, anti-Putinist regime, and nothing like destruction of Ukraine occurred. But he continues this idea of preparation of his people for the large war. I suppose not because he wants to start the war. He understands rather well that it's impossible for today's Russia, and it is absolutely impossible for his personal future. But he wants to produce a situation where he has free possibilities with Europe. Europe is much stronger than Russia, Europe and NATO, much stronger than Russia in military aspect, in economical aspect, in scientific aspect. But what has Russia? Russia has nuclear weapons. And that's why he supposed, just as North Korea, to defend his inner state, his policy, by this possibility to use nuclear weapons in theory, not in practice, but in theory.
Thank you very much. But Russia does not only have nuclear weapons, it has propaganda, and it has media, or let's call them, frankly, propaganda outlets in the West, to name only Russia Today. So I'm wondering whether, how the West could counter these efforts, and especially if we do have any means of influencing or reaching out to the Russian public, because we don't only want to avoid war by deterring the Russians, but basically what we want, as Mr. Pöttering rightly said, we want to live together peacefully with Russians. So is there any way for the West to reach the hearts and minds of the Russian population?
Yeah, I think, first of all, and in principle, we cannot reciprocate in kind to Russian propaganda, neither in the content, nor in the methods, nor in the institutions. You know, the basic approach of Russian propaganda today, or Russian media, which is the same thing if we talk about state-controlled ones, the basic approach is top-down, right? There is a clear command structure from the Kremlin down to the different television chains and down to the last little troll working in a troll office in St. Petersburg with 600 people being there constantly working on social media. So there's a chain of command. We will not, we should not, we cannot produce this. Also, the thing we cannot do is to play with alternate realities. You know, the Bible, so to speak, on Russian propaganda and the Western response has been written half a year ago by a Brit named Peter Pomerantsev and Andrew Weiss, an American researcher. It's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which neatly sums up this methodology of the new Russian propaganda. It's different from the Soviet one, you know. Soviet one was one big lie. The new Russian propaganda plays with different possibilities until nothing is real anymore. And, you know, here again, this cannot be our answer. So what can be our answer? What must be our answer is, first of all, well, we have to recognize the problem, right? We have to analyze Russian propaganda and its mechanisms. And the Martens Center is working on something. On the 16th of June, we're coming out with a major research paper on this called, slightly funnily, Muzzling the Bear. But it's about how to respond. And, you know, so we need to analyze the methods. And, you know, then we need to mobilize civil society. It's not up to governments, and it's not up to EU institutions, sorry to say that in this room, to give the main answer to Russian propaganda. Governments can help. The EU, the External Action Service can help with strategic communication and so on. But ultimately, they shouldn't hire people. They should fund projects that come from political parties, think tanks, foundations, networks, individuals, right? That should be the backbone of the Western answer. And it will be bottom up, not top down. And of course, there will be a lot of internal contradictions. There'll be double and triple work being done. There'll be waste of energy and time. All that will be true. And yet, only that can be our answer to Russian propaganda.
Thank you very much, and I think now it's high time to open the floor to the public. So first of all, I would like to invite Mr. Snyder back on the stage. And I think we have 2 mics going around. Okay, so whoever wants to ask a question, simply raise your hand, and then we'll have the mics going around. I think the gentleman in the front row was first.
Thank you very much. And my question is, why are we today here still reacting to Russian propaganda instead of creating a common European history narrative? Because actually, we do have the same European-Russian narrative about World War II. That is, including Soviet Union's role as a victim of aggression and liberator of Europe. And I have always started my speeches with a phrase: to start World War II, you needed 2. You needed 2 dictators. And what we lack is, we don't know about the substance of the Soviet policies, but we can only say that 2 dictators matched each other in their criminality. And so what we need is to know better in Western part of Europe about this side of Stalin's dictatorship. By the way, helping almost for two years to Hitler to conquer Western Europe, providing him with political aid, with economic aid, then treating his own people. Mr. Snyder mentioned about 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. And this is a fact in itself. Why did they surrender? I think the Russian historian Mark Salonin has provided an answer to that. But what was done with the survivors? They were immediately transferred from Nazi camps to Soviet Gulag because they were guilty of surviving. This was considered as betrayal. So what we really need is to develop a common European narrative as much as possible. The ideal versions are not possible, of course, about what happened in World War II. And I must say, I was elected 11 years ago to this parliament from Bloodland, Estonia. My biggest disappointment here was the absolute lack of my Western European colleagues about the history and experiences of Bloodland countries. So I fully agree with what Mr. Snyder said, that we must take responsibility for our history, each country. It can't be collective responsibility, and this reminds me of Sergei Kovalyov from Memorial, who once told us that until Germans, ordinary Germans, did not realize that they too are responsible for mass murders and Auschwitz, Nazism was not definitely defeated. And Mr. Kovalyov says, until we, ordinary Russians, do not understand that we too bear some of responsibility for Stalinist crimes, the Soviet crimes will survive. And the problem today is that not addressing Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the real substance of the Soviet Union means repeating it, as it was said in today's reactions of European far right and so on. But to take responsibility does not blame other nations. And Kovalyov also said that each nation has something to be ashamed of. No nation is perfect, so we all need to take a critical analysis of our own pasts. And then we can arrive to mark May the 9th as Europe's Day. It will be in few days' time, 65 years from Schuman Declaration, and this is something to celebrate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as far as I understand, you didn't have a question, it was more a remark, so I would ask Mr. Saryusz-Wolski to ask his question.
The first question goes to Professor Snyder. In the invitation to this conference, I read, 1945 laid the foundations for durable European peace, which was formalized by the Helsinki Accords of 1975. Ukrainians today say that Helsinki was the second Yalta. What's your comment? And a question to Roland Freudenstein in relation to what Professor Francois Toms said about rehabilitating Cold War. On countering Russian propaganda, let's rehabilitate the good instruments of the Cold War era, which we knew on the other side of the Iron Curtain, which was Radio Free Europe and Radio Svoboda. Let's create serious, robust institutions, this time TV channels, not radio. Why to reinvent the wheel? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to start?
So one thing which strikes me about contemporary Ukraine as opposed to contemporary Russia is that the contemporary Ukrainian discussion is largely about what's actually happening in the world. So there are controversies in Ukraine about corruption, about decentralization, about who should be fighting the war, how the war should be fought, but not everything in Ukraine goes back to the Second World War. And when people ask what's the difference between Russia and Ukraine, there are 1,000 things to say. But one thing which is really striking to me is that the emergence of Ukrainian political identity actually has to do with events that are happening now. It has to do with children and family members and friends who took part in a revolution, or children and family members or friends who were taking part in a war. And so this is all by way of saying, when you say that Ukrainians say that Helsinki was another Yalta, all well and good, but the myths of the end of the Second World War are just less important now in Ukraine than they are in Russia, and that's something which is worth remarking upon. As far as Helsinki goes, I mean, the thing which I would stress about Helsinki is that Helsinki was the moment, as colleagues have already stressed, when the Brezhnev regime was seeking after a conservative solution. Right? It's of the same historical moment in the Soviet Union as the beginning of the commemoration of the war. The Soviet Union is no longer about transformation, it's about stabilization, it's about control. And the trade that was made at Helsinki was that the West agreed to accept the borders of 1945, and in return to get arms control and formal agreement about human rights. Whether that was a bad bargain or not, I'm not so sure, because the discussion about human rights that then began in Prague and Warsaw and in Ukraine, in Kiev, where there was also a Helsinki group, was one of the foundations for the Ukrainian liberation movement. So I think it's at least ambiguous. On this propaganda question, I just wanted to say one thing very quickly. A very old-fashioned way to address Russian propaganda is to send print journalists to Ukraine. The only thing which has saved German popular discourse about this war has been the presence of actual physical German journalists in Ukraine. That is very old-fashioned, and it's worth remembering because it's one of the ways that we are like Russia. We rely more and more on pictures that are retransmitted from other places. The only thing that can fight pictures are actual human beings who are present in the spot.
Yeah, just briefly on the Cold War and the media. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty exists. Actually, a couple of years ago, someone wanted to cut their funding completely. I think that is off the table. But indeed, I think they could use a bit more financial instruments, to put it mildly. Now, this is coming back to your question. I mean, who do we focus on here in trying to reach out to Russians? There are two groups. There are Russian-speaking citizens or residents of countries of the European Union and of the neighborhood, who are usually rather hooked on Russian state media today. And it's going to be a huge challenge, but to pry them off from that dependency and deliver independent information in Russian, I think, is one of the ways to go. And the other one is Russian expats. Now, Russian expats, sometimes you are preaching to the converted because they are quite embarrassed themselves by what is happening at home. And they already use and watch Western media, and yet to focus more precisely on that group of highly educated and often very, very qualified people working in Western countries and Western institutions, I think is a worthwhile undertaking. Just one last word about the Cold War. Indeed, it is it's actually the fourth war that we should mention in this context. The Cold War, when somebody accuses me of being a Cold Warrior, I take it as a compliment, because it was a noble cause, by and large, because the right side won, and it was, in the end, it was a confrontation, and because deterrence worked, because the peace was kept by deterrence, including, mark my words, nuclear deterrence. In other words, we are sitting here in this building discussing freely because the United States risked thermonuclear war for a couple of decades. This is, and this continues to be true, and we better remember this for the future. So much for the Cold War.
I saw other hands.
Ich habe ein Mikrofon hier. Kann ich vielleicht gerade was sagen? Ist das möglich?
There's the lady in the middle of the row. Can somebody pass a mic around?
Bonjour, je me présente, je suis physicien informaticien, je suis citoyenne européenne, avec tout mon grand respect pour votre commémoration. Mes questions s'adressent à la situation d'aujourd'hui. Je pose la question à M. Pottering. Vous avez dit qu'il faut être fort et dialoguer avec la Russie. Ma question est, quel dialogue vous voulez faire avec la Russie? Où Poutine fait une propagande de guerre maintenant dans la Russie, où Poutine ne comprend que seulement des sanctions économiques. Quelle est votre puissance de dialogue? Et si les institutions européennes veulent dialoguer avec Poutine, que vous mettez en priorité le respect des droits des hommes dans des prisonniers russes et surtout politiques et l'existence d'une coalition, d'une opposition politique en Russie que Poutine extermine physiquement et moralement aujourd'hui. Deuxième question très courte, pourquoi le génocide de 2 millions de Juifs fait par Staline n'est pas reconnu par le Parlement européen et ni par l'USA comme génocide? Dans ce cas-là, la Russie devait payer des dommagements. À Madame Kaniente, qui est le maire de Lituanie, vous avez une grande minorité russe en Lituanie. Quelle est la situation de propagande pro-russe faite par Poutine dans cette minorité? Est-ce que cette minorité veut rester en Lituanie ou est-ce qu'elle veut appartenir à la Russie?
Mr. Chairman, you probably start because you were addressed directly. There's a mic there.
Yeah, but I'm not on the panel anymore, so is it okay if I speak in English? In Deutsch, okay. Ich will Ihnen ein Beispiel geben. Und meine Haltung gegenüber Russland ist, glaube ich, glasklar. Wir bekamen als Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung eine Anfrage von dem Kulturbeauftragten des russischen Präsidenten, mit uns eine Tagung durchzuführen. Und er hat mich besucht Dieser Mann, und er war sehr nah bei Jelzin, also deswegen verdient er auch deswegen schon ein wenig Vertrauen. Und ich habe diesem Mann, als er mich vor 4, 5 Monaten besuchte, gesagt, ich bin einverstanden, dass wir eine Tagung machen in Berlin. Die russische Seite, Sie bringen vielleicht 10 Leute mit, wir haben 10 Leute. Aber wenn wir eine solche Konferenz machen, dann müssen Sie sicher sein, dass ich das sage, was ich für die Wahrheit halte. Und dann sagt er, ja, okay. Und er wollte, dass wir im Gespräch bleiben, dass wir nicht sagen, wir stoppen jedes Gespräch. Dann fand diese Tagung statt in Berlin vor etwa 3 Wochen. Ich hatte das erste Wort, als war er Gastgeber, weil das in der Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung stattfand. Ich habe gesprochen von der Aggression Russlands gegen die Ukraine, von der Annexion der Krim und habe gesagt, dieses ist altes Denken, das ist die Politik des 18. und 19. Jahrhunderts. Dann antwortete er und sagte, wenn wir uns vor 20 Jahren hier getroffen hätten und Sie hätten so geredet, wie Sie geredet haben, wir, die Russen, hätten den Saal verlassen. Und er wollte damit sagen, jetzt ist eine andere Zeit und wir wollen miteinander reden. Und ich halte es für richtiger, demjenigen, in diesem Fall Russland, der eine Aggression macht, der das Selbstbestimmungsrecht der Ukraine nicht akzeptiert, diesen Gesprächspartnern immer wieder zu sagen, damit sie wissen, wie wir denken. Würden wir nicht miteinander sprechen, dann würden sie gar nicht wissen, wie wir dieses verbrecherische Verhalten beurteilen. Und deswegen halte ich es immer für wichtig, eine Doppelstrategie zu haben, die Wahrheit zu sagen, was wir für die Wahrheit halten, aber auf der gleichen Seite das Gespräch nicht abzuschließen. Nur das ist die Möglichkeit, dass man versucht, wieder zu gemeinsamer Politik zu kommen. Und Russland akzeptiert heute nicht unsere Werte. Und das müssen wir Russland sagen, beginnend mit der Führung.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think Timothy Snyder wanted to answer the second question.
Oui, j'ai bien peur qu'il est arrivé un malentendu. Quand on parle de 2 millions de juifs soviétiques qui ont été tués, il s'agit de la Shoah. Il s'agit de la Shoah. Et ce que je voulais dire, c'est justement que les citoyens soviétiques ont pris parti dans ce crime, comme les citoyens d'ailleurs d'autres pays européens. Donc, il faudrait une discussion sur la participation des citoyens soviétiques, comme on a déjà vu en Pologne ou en France. Ce n'est pas le cas qu'il y avait une tuerie soviétique contre les Juifs. Il y a une politique antisémite, bien sûr, après la guerre. Mais quand on parle de 2,5 millions de Juifs soviétiques tués, il s'agit de la Shoah dans les terres soviétiques occupées.
Thank you. I think we still have time for a couple of questions.
Est-ce que je peux donner la réponse sur la situation des russophones en Lettonie? À la fin de l'année passée, le gouvernement letton a fait une étude sur l'opinion publique et surtout dans sa partie des russophones de Lettonie. Et le plus encourageant que la majorité des russophones ne voit pas sa future avec la Russie de Poutine.
Gentleman with the booklet in his hand, I think. There? On your other side? That's it. I don't know.
Ich versuche es jetzt nochmal, wenn ich darf.
Go ahead.
Vielen Dank. Ich würde meine Frage auch sehr gerne in der Sprache von Schiller und Goethe stellen. Auch das wird gestattet. Vielen Dank. Man würde jetzt gerne, und das macht sich ja bemerkbar hier bei vielen Anwesenden, sehr intensiv über vieles jetzt sprechen. Ich würde auch ganz gerne einen Vortrag halten, wie viele hier. Aber das geht nun leider nicht. Deswegen eine Frage nur ganz kurz an Professor Snyder. Eine beliebte Frage an den Historiker, Professor Snyder, ist die Frage, wie geht das ja nun weiter? Welche Perspektiven zeichnen sich dann ab? Welche Alternativen kann man sich überhaupt vorstellen? Von der europäischen Perspektive und insbesondere von der deutschen ist es uns natürlich ein größtes Anliegen, in freundschaftlichster Beziehung zu den Russen zu stehen. Eine tiefe kulturelle Zusammenarbeit und ein Zusammenwirken. Das ist eigentlich das europäische Wunschbild. Aber wie sieht denn das in der Wirklichkeit aus? Und da möchte ich ganz gern doch nochmal, und ich hoffe, das wird mir gestattet, auch nochmal auf die andere Seite der Medaille hinweisen. Es gab im März war das, im Bundestag eine lebhafte Debatte über die Hauptziele der US-amerikanischen Politik seit 100 Jahren. Sie kennen sicherlich alle dieses berühmte Video von George Friedman, Strafford Think Tank, wo er ungeschminkt in sehr deutlichen Worten darauf hinweist, dass das Hauptziel der US-amerikanischen Politik seit 100 Jahren bis heute ist, mit allen zur Verfügung stehenden Mitteln zu verhindern, dass es eine russisch-deutsche, heute kann man vielleicht sagen russisch-europäische Zusammenarbeit gibt. Zu verhindern, dass diese zwei Seiten überhaupt zusammenkommen. Professor Schneider, das ist ein zweiter Vortrag. Ich wäre Ihnen trotzdem sehr dankbar, wenn Sie etwas zu dieser Seite der Medaille sagen könnten.
Thank you very much. And I would propose to have two more questions, then answer them together. Please be very brief. The lady in the front.
Oui, merci. D'abord, je voudrais dire ce que moi j'ai compris à propos de cette conférence. Je pense que l'Europe est en guerre actuellement avec la Russie. Anyway, I have a question for Sir Snyder? Sorry. While your speech, you say there is difference between fascism and Nazism. Can you explain a little more about that, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last question. I already apologize for everybody who wasn't in the position to ask a question. This gentleman waving with his booklet the whole time.
Okay, thank you. I'm David Price of the Schumann Project. I've written some books on Schumann, on the origin of the community system. And the topic today is about war and peace. And very little has been said about peace. And it's the 65th anniversary of the Schumann Declaration, which made war not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. And this is obviously a clue to how to deal with Mr. Putin. One of the things is, already been mentioned, the rule of law. And the other thing is the material side, is the anti-cartel system, which has not been mentioned, is one of the black secrets of West European history, that we had cartels. We had an armaments cartel working before the First World War. We had people like E.G. Farben with a worldwide monopoly of patents and Krupp paying for Hitler and so on. And we have now an anti-cartel system in the European community. Now, I would like to ask how these two aspects can help us deal with Mr. Putin.
Okay, I think the first question went to you, and then whoever wants to answer the other questions.
Okay, so three comments. I'll try to be as brief as I can. On the question of National Socialism and fascism, fascism was a broader European phenomenon. There were fascists all across Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. Along with communism, it was generally thought to be one of the alternatives to democracy, which in the 1930s people generally had thought had failed. So fascism is a part of European history. It's also a part of a particular Soviet description of the world, which divides the world into fascists and anti-fascists and treats themselves as the anti-fascists and everyone else as the fascists. So it has a historical, it has a true historical foundation, but it also has a kind of rhetorical capacity. I would say that National Socialism in Germany was an example of fascism, but it had certain special features, such as the definition of Jews as a threat to the entire planet. Nazi anti-Semitism went beyond where most fascist anti-Semitism went. On the question of German-Russian understanding, I mean, I think that, verstehen beginnt mit begreifen. It's very important when one talks about German-Russian understanding to make sure that we understand what Russia we are talking about. Very often what Germans have in mind when they say Russia is the Soviet Union, and when they think about German debts toward Russia, they mean the Soviet Union. I think it's important for Germans to remember that when they invaded the Soviet Union, they started by invading Eastern Poland and the Baltic states. And they continued by invading the territories of what's now Belarus and Ukraine, that the people on the territory of Belarus and Ukraine suffered proportionately much more than Russians did. When I hear Germans say, I would like to begin a process of understanding with Belarus and Ukraine and then move on to Russia, when I hear one German ever say that, which I've never heard in my entire life, I will then start to believe in this business of German-Russian understanding. It has to start with the crimes that Germany actually committed, which are against the Jews first, Belarusians second, Ukrainians third, Poles fourth, Russians fifth. And what they did in Russia was extremely significant, but it's part of a larger process. As far as the I wish American foreign policy had a coherence that went back 100 years. It would be a much simpler world if our foreign policy had a coherence which went back 100 years. But there was nothing. I mean, that's the claim that American foreign policy has been designed to keep Germany and Russia apart is totally ludicrous. American foreign policy in the 1920s and 1930s was totally isolated from Europe. Germany and Russia got together in 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had nothing to do with the United States. The United States' American policy during the Second World War was to engage the Soviet Union to fight against Germany. That's the strongest example of Soviet-American relations, was the common war that they fought against Nazi Germany. So the idea that there's some coherence and the Americans have always been there to keep the Germans and the Russians apart is just silly. But it's part of a larger problem in Europe, which is that the crisis today is a European crisis. And on the left and on the right, there are these attempts to export it to America, right? In the center right, Europeans say, well, let the Americans solve it. The Americans are not going to solve it because they're just not that interested. On the center left and the left, there's the idea that the Americans started it. The Americans did not start the revolution in Ukraine. They had nothing to do with it. They were absent. And the Ukrainians complained very bitterly about it, and correctly so. You Europeans cannot solve this problem by exporting it to the United States and saying either it's our fault or we should clean it up, because it's not our fault and we're not going to clean it up. It's a European problem. And so these attempts to find these fantastical theories about how it's all the Americans, I think are always a step in the wrong direction. That was it, I think.
Thank you. And Jacek wanted to say something.
Yes, I would like to go back to this short discussion on propaganda, because during the Cold War, as you mentioned it, West was not so weak as it is now, but it's difficult to repeat everything what was done during Cold War. For example, British had in Foreign Office this semi-secret department, information research department, which was a place where they were producing ideas, giving information to friendly journalists. Well, doing the same now would cause only accusations from Russia, and of course it's against the freedom of press. It was a different time, Cold War. We don't know if we are going back to something similar. For sure, it would be a different Cold War, hopefully not, but I can't imagine an alternative scenario. Alternative scenario could be only a kind of return to policy of appeasement, not to see what happened in Crimea, and particularly violation of Budapest Declaration about borders of Ukraine, about integration, and we must remember that Ukraine decided not to have nuclear weapons for this Budapest Declaration, and was simply cheated as we now see it. Thank you.
Thank you, and I just learned that our last speaker will restrict himself to a couple of minutes. This gives us the opportunity for another, but that's probably the last round of questions. Starting there in the back. Okay, but before we have to say goodbye to Mr. Zubov. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the possibility to take part in this very interesting session and to express my opinion. You see, as a rule, we speak Russian opinion, Russian position, but Russia is different. And it's always necessary to understand that Russia is different. We have official Kremlin position, and we have a position of other people, of other political parties, parties who are in position, and simple people, both historians and non-historians, who don't support this absurdic Putin's politics of today. So thank you very much to support this non-official position of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zubov. It's always good to have the dissenting voices from Russia at the table. But now let's proceed with our discussion.
So it would sound a bit strange after Professor Zubov saying I represent the Russian mission to the European Union. I want also to add a couple of words to this discussion. So I really think that's what's most important to understand each other, because Russian people do not in no way want any kind of confrontation with Europe. And to understand what's going on now, we need to remember the historic lessons. Today's conference is called War and Peace. First of all, we have to realize what has happened during the terrible war and why Russian people and all the people of the former Soviet Union, of Europe and other parts of the world celebrate this victory against Nazism, which I can say was the most awful disaster of all history of humankind. And of course, it cannot be in no way compared to any kind of other political regimes or systems. I would not cite any evidences of victims of Holocaust, but I think it's worth mentioning that it's not the case. And I think I would like to ask a brief question. Don't you think that it will be a huge mistake to put on equal footing those who defeated Nazism and those who tried to conquer Europe and all of the world? Mentioning the history of war, we should not say only about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, but also Munich Agreement. I think without mentioning it, it won't be wise to go further to understand the role of other countries in appeasement Hitler. And of course, coming back to...
What's your question?
My question is, don't you think that we must speak about history in all its... in the history of the World War, and not about certain elements of that, and of course not to blame Russia for everything that happens in the world nowadays, because I hope we'll find a way for our common peace in the world. Thank you.
Very briefly.
So here's the thing about Munich. Munich was a bad thing. No one is rehabilitating Munich. The line of Russian foreign policy has been, if you talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we'll remind you of Munich. But here's the difference. Nobody is rehabilitating Munich. Everyone thinks that Munich is a bad thing. Whereas Russian policy is rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact rather than saying it's a bad thing. The general position in the West is Munich bad, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact also bad. So I'm happy to talk about Munich. Munich was a disaster of British, French, and foreign policy. It was a terrible mistake. However, no one in the West disagrees with that. Munich is a symbol of something bad in the West, just as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact should be a symbol of something bad in Russia.
Okay, so one last question. Gentleman on the front.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Victor Artemenko from the Wilfried Martens Center. My question is to the panel. It's more than a year than when Crimea was annexed. It's almost a year when the aggression, the war, started in the eastern region of Ukraine. And a lot of people in Europe and in different countries, in member states and in European institutions, desperately seeking for getting back to business as usual. But how it's possible if Crimea is still annexed, if the war is still happening? Yes, it's not that intense, but it's still happening. So the question is how to explain to those people who are seeking for get back to business as usual that it's not possible until first until the things get back to normal, and second, everybody admits that they committed they did some mistakes, and at least ask sorry. Yeah, this is the question.
And the question is for whom?
I don't know, maybe some
who
of the
wants to
panelists.
answer the question?
Mr. Snyder.
Je vais répondre en français parce que je suis plus à l'aise en français. L'argument qu'on peut formuler, c'est que le conflit ukrainien n'est pas seulement un conflit, c'est pas seulement un conflit à propos de l'Ukraine et du sort de l'Ukraine en Europe, c'est un conflit européen. Ce n'est pas un conflit, c'est un conflit qui concerne l'Europe. Ce n'est pas un conflit géopolitique, c'est un conflit politique. Ce qui oppose la Russie et ce qui a provoqué la réaction russe et l'agression russe contre l'Ukraine, c'est le choix européen de l'Ukraine. C'est-à-dire que ça traduit l'attitude russe face à l'Union européenne, face à l'Europe. Au fond de cette réaction, il y a une hostilité fondamentale à l'égard de ce qu'est l'Europe, des valeurs européennes. Et c'est pourquoi on ne peut pas reprendre le business as usual en mettant le conflit ukrainien entre parenthèses, comme on avait déjà mis le démembrement de la Géorgie entre parenthèses, et on était passé au business as usual, et on a même vendu des armes à Poutine tout de suite après. Le message était catastrophique. Le résultat, c'est qu'on a une escalade. Donc, je crois que le précédent de la Géorgie doit nous instruire et nous inciter à éviter de refaire les mêmes erreurs.
And I would not like to finish without one appeal, because we spoke much about theoretical things, but there would be one step, for example, which would be very helpful and which could be started from the European Parliament. In Germany, we have until 6 million native Russian speakers. Many of them watch Russian television. I have many examples how this hatred, this propaganda is brought into our society in Baltic states, everywhere. We have the same situation. We have many Russian journalists, popular journalists, who would love to have a free Russian TV project. It would be even commercial, would be interesting after 2 or 3 years. We have to start our own information service for Russian people here, and later we can try to get it towards there. But please do something, do something. It's something we can do. It's not so expensive, and it can help. And we can say, Russia, if you don't let our television in Russia, we stop Russia today here. And at least we could get away, we could stop Russia today. And please do something. Thank you.
This question reminds me of a more fundamental point. That the conflict in Ukraine today is not about language or ethnicity. It's fundamentally about the rule of law. Ukrainians wanted the rule of law, and they saw Europe as a way to bring the rule of law into their country. This is why Europeans have to hold steady. The rule of law is what you have. When you make exceptions to this because of Russia or for any other reason, you're undercutting not only the Ukrainians, you're fundamentally undercutting yourself. This is a contest about the rule of law. Europe can win, but only if it plays by its own rules.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the panelists. We have a closing remark now, but I always say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for attending this event, and I hope we'll see each other again in a more joyful surrounding, commemorating the end of the third war that didn't happen.
Dear friends, just bear with us for a moment. It's always, it's a challenging task for me to conclude this conference. First of all, because obviously we are over time. Secondly, because as the classic joke goes, I'm between you and the lunch. But I would say actually thirdly, because normally the task of the closing speaker is also to give a kind of positive conclusion and positive side for the future, and take into account that our last panel, the words like fourth war and nuclear war was mentioned, it will be a challenge. However, maybe one point to take home definitely from this conference, that history is back in politics. The argument of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, that Western liberal democracy is the end point of humanity's socio-cultural evolution, was one very often used in this building, and one which was very convenient for us also. But take into account the latest developments, the discussions, and the references which were made also in this panel to the Cold War and to comparison to the times before Second World War in Europe, one can really see that history can be seen linearic, but it can have cyclical elements, and certain underlying trends can repeat themselves. As Dr. Pöttering underlined in the very beginning, history has enormous force. The narrative of war and peace, the horrors of war and the desire for peace was the building stone and the core narrative for the European Union. And now, as we have spoken, the same narrative of war and peace are being used in Russia, but for the different purpose, to push the nationalistic sentiment. And of course, as stated many times in our discussion, the concern is here that Russia, with its propaganda, with its action in Ukraine, and with its threats to EU member states, that Putin is creating himself a situation that the only way to release that internal tension, in fact, is to have escalation of conflict with external actors like the West. I think it's unrealistic to maybe hope that those critical remarks and points which were made here during this conference can really penetrate the Russian debate. But I think the real concern which we have to take into account is the fact that we have to be very careful that that distorted narrative is not exported to Europe, to our political debate. To be very concrete, there are many populist parties populist parties with a close relation with Putin's Russia, who wouldn't mind that, for example, the role of the United States would be undermined in the historic discussion about what were the reasons which really ended the Second World War. Okay, I would like to thank the EPP group, especially Vice President Sandra Kalniete. Thank you very much. You have been an excellent host. Applauses. Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Dr. Hans-Gert Pöttering, who unfortunately had to already leave. Nico Lange. Nico is there, who was the leading factor in the project here from CAST side. And from Martens Center side, Roland Freudenstein, our deputy director, who was the leader from Martens Center side. And of course, the CAST team and our team, Ingrid and Bernarda, who were driving forces. Now, just bear me 1 minute. I come back to this positive end note. I tried to come back to it. And as you many of you noticed that in Economist, in the last Economist week ago, there was actually an article specifically focusing on this issue what we have discussed today. And there was very interesting description about what really happened, at least what was a surprise for me, what really was the atmosphere in Moscow 70 years, 9th of May. So 70 years ago in Moscow, so I quote, people waved American British flags, Many went to the American embassy to embrace the Allies. And someone picked up an American sailor or soldier and lifted him in the air, recalls Inna Solviona, a Russian scholar who was 17 at the time. It was a genuinely happy day. It was the victory of the people, of every one of us. So I guess we can all conclude with the hope that this spirit of this testimonial would become the core, finally the core of the interpretation of the meaning and the purpose of the meaning of the May 9th. And maybe one day in the future, this same spirit could be the defining factor in the relation between Russia and the West. We remember war so we can live in peace. Thank you very much.